Around evening at the Ilsung Height Villa inside a quiet apartment, a young man walked into the living room. There, something immediately caught his attention, a travel suitcase sitting in plain view. The sight of it took him by surprise and he paused, unsure of its meaning. While he didn't ask about it right away, he made a mental note to bring it up with his stepmother the next day. As he stood there, a thought lingered in his mind. He reflected on how people who fall into addiction often begin to lose control over their actions, and with time, they can even lose their sense of identity altogether. With that uneasy thought, he went to check on his stepmother, whom he respectfully called Ajumma. The next morning, he greeted her politely and asked if she had slept well. She acknowledged his greeting and mentioned that she had already prepared breakfast. Curious, he brought up that he had thought she was going to make curry. She responded that he had curry the day before and what she made today was also quite good. She then served him the meal with a small smile of confidence. As he began to eat, he noticed her eyes fixed on him. Her gaze made him feel slightly on edge, and though he tried to stay composed, it was difficult under her silent scrutiny. She explained that she was just watching to see if he liked the taste, but her intense stare made him nervous. He jokingly remarked that eating under that kind of pressure might give him indigestion even if he was full. After the death of his father, his stepmother, CornhwaSama, had been left behind. Once things settled after the funeral and all the necessary arrangements were taken care of, the two of them began living together in the apartment. He still remembered the first time he met her. The impression she left on him that day remained vivid in his memory. She had seemed cold, strict, and even slightly intimidating. Her presence felt distant and reserved, with an air of seriousness that made her seem almost dangerous. But he also remembered something else, that she had told him she had always wished to have a son. He was pulled out of his thoughts when she called his name, reminding him not to pick out the beans from the bowl and to eat everything. She even tried to feed him the beans herself, and although he protested that he wasn't a child anymore, she insisted. In the end, he had no choice but to eat them. Then, as the thought of the suitcase returned to his mind, he mentioned it to her, asking what it was for. She began to explain that now that he was grown up, but before she could finish, the sound of a message notification interrupted her. She quickly checked her phone, then stood up in a rush. Glancing at the time, she remarked that the morning had passed by faster than she realized. She said she was already running late for work and that they could talk more when she returned home later. Before leaving, she reminded him to come back safely from college and not to be late. Later that day, Jiwon was at college, walking alongside his friend. The weather was warm, and his friend casually mentioned feeling unusually hot, wondering if it was just him. Jiwon simply responded that it probably was, implying it wasn't that hot. Taking that as a challenge, his friend playfully accused Jiwon of suggesting he was too skinny, comparing himself to an anchovy. Determined to prove his point, he added that he was more muscular than Jiwon and even flexed his thin arms with exaggerated confidence, making a show of his biceps despite their clear lack of bulk. Meanwhile, not far from where they were standing, an upperclassman was trying to talk a female junior, Suyeon, into eating lunch with him. Since there were no more classes that day, he used it as an excuse to invite her out. However, Suyeon politely but firmly turned him down. Jiwon noticed the interaction from a distance. His friend, catching on as well, leaned in and explained that the upperclassman had been persistently bothering Suyeon for a while now. Even though she clearly disliked the attention, he kept pushing, refusing to back off. As the situation unfolded, Suyeon suddenly spotted Jiwon. Her face lit up and she called out to him with enthusiasm, asking if he was heading to college. However, Jiwon remained distant and unresponsive, his reaction quiet and detached. His friend nudged him in the side, whispering that Suyeon was clearly reaching out to him, not only to chat, but also possibly seeking help to escape the persistent upperclassman. He added that she might even be trying to ask Jiwon out. Despite this, Jiwon bluntly replied that he had made a promise to his mother and needed to leave early. His friend grew irritated and told him to just make up an excuse to come home late, but Jiwon insisted that his mother said she had something important to tell him. Without further explanation, he took his leave. Watching him go, his friend couldn't help but mutter in disbelief, calling Jiwon a mama's boy for walking away from both Suyeon's request and a clear opportunity. As Jiwon made his way home, his thoughts drifted to a memory. He remembered when his stepmother, Haesoo, once told him that she would stay by his side until he started college. The words lingered in his mind, especially now. Sitting alone on the bus, he looked troubled, the worry on his face subtle but present. When he finally arrived home, he noticed something strange. The apartment was dark. None of the lights were on, which was unusual. He stepped in cautiously and turned on the lights. The moment the room lit up, he saw clothing scattered messily on the floor, giving the impression that someone had left in a hurry. His eyes quickly searched for the suitcase he had seen before, but it was nowhere to be found. Alarmed, he rushed into Haisu's room. She was startled by his sudden entrance and asked what was wrong. Jaewon, visibly agitated, explained that he had thought she had left him. The combination of the missing suitcase and the dark apartment had triggered the fear that she might have disappeared without saying anything. Haisu calmly reassured him that she hadn't gone anywhere. She explained that she had simply moved the suitcase and had no intention of leaving. With a steady voice, she promised that she would not abandon him. Despite her words, Jaewon still seemed uncertain. Needing comfort, he asked if he could stay with her for the night. Later that night, Jaewon was seen lying in bed in his room. The silence was heavy and he stared at the ceiling and thought. Not long after, Haisu quietly entered his room. That night, Haisu quietly chose to spend the night together with Jaewon, staying by his side. The atmosphere was quiet, though no words were spoken about the arrangement. The next scene shifted to a rainy day at a high school. Outside, the rain poured steadily and Jaewon stood near the school building without an umbrella. A female classmate stood nearby, proudly showing off her umbrella, mentioning that her mother had thoughtfully prepared it for her. When Jaewon asked if they could share it at least until the nearest convenience store, the girl hesitated and then refused. She explained that the umbrella was too small to cover both of them, insisting it was a mini umbrella, and walked off by herself. Left standing in the rain, Jaewon couldn't help but feel a little self-conscious. He wondered if she had refused to share the umbrella because of something unpleasant. Maybe he smelled bad? But he quickly reminded himself that he showered every day. Before he could dwell on it too long, the girl turned around briefly and snapped that her refusal had nothing to do with that, then left him behind in the rain. As he stood there debating whether to wait out the rain, Jaewon was unexpectedly surprised to see Haisu arriving. She was drenched from head to toe, clearly having rushed over without any concern for getting wet. She held up an umbrella, saying that she had realized he forgot his and came to bring it to him. She admitted that she was in such a hurry that she only brought one umbrella. Without hesitation, the two of them began walking together under the single umbrella. As they walked, she casually asked him what he would like to eat for dinner that night, making the moment feel normal despite how soaked she was. The following day, Haisu was at her workplace. She sat at her desk, her face pale and the dark circles under her eyes impossible to miss. She silently acknowledged to herself that she hadn't gotten a single minute of sleep the night before. She recalled that she had intended to leave Jaewon's room once he fell asleep, but he had seemed tense and self-aware the entire night, preventing her from slipping away. Now she felt a growing sense of urgency. She had to find a solution, and fast. Turning to her computer, she searched online for forums and resources related to her situation. She found a thread that introduced an agency offering help in circumstances like hers and considered contacting them. Just as she was deep in thought, her subordinate, Jihu, startled her with his sudden appearance, asking if she was okay. He pointed out that she looked very pale. In response, she asked him if she really looked that bad and then quickly shut off her computer. She told Jihu she would be heading out early to meet someone and that he could leave whenever he finished his own work. Jihu agreed but quietly assumed she was just stressed out about the current project. He noted to himself that Haisu had a habit of over-worrying about work, which he considered both her flaw and her strength, something he secretly admired about her. Later, Haisu was seen sitting in a quiet corner of a coffee shop, waiting as she stirred her drink absent-mindedly. Her friend soon arrived, taking a seat across from her and immediately noticing something was off. With a knowing look, she remarked that Haisu appeared deeply troubled, specifically about a man. Haisu was taken aback and asked how her friend had figured that out. Her friend simply pointed out that it was written all over her face, clear as day. She then asked if Haisu had canceled her upcoming trip because of this mysterious man. After a brief pause, Haisu admitted that she had. Her friend, clearly surprised, commented that she always believed Haisu would be fine without having a man in her life and asked who this man was that had affected her so much. When Haisu calmly answered that it was her stepson, her friend was so shocked that she accidentally spat her drink straight into Haisu's face. Without losing her composure, Haisu gave her a cold look and said she'd let it go this time, but warned her not to do it again. Her friend quickly apologized and handed her a napkin to wipe her face, trying to compose herself before asking Haisu to explain what exactly was going on with Jaewon. Haisu looked uncertain, admitting that she didn't even know where to begin. Eventually, she gathered her thoughts and shared everything that had happened, step by step. Her friend listened carefully, growing visibly more alarmed with each detail. When Haisu finished, her friend asked why she hadn't pushed Jaewon away more firmly. Haisu responded that because she wasn't his biological mother, she felt it was only right to be kinder to him, perhaps more lenient than she should have been. Without another word, her friend suddenly stood up, clearly determined. She told Haisu to go home and promised she would figure something out, but insisted that Haisu must not interfere. Haisu, unsure, asked if her friend was certain she could handle it. Her friend gave a confident nod, saying she could so long as Haisu agreed to leave everything to her. With that, the two left the coffee shop together. Back at home, Jaiwon was sitting quietly when he noticed a notification on his phone. It was a message from Haisu, one that had arrived 20 minutes earlier, mentioning that her friend would be coming over. Just as he finished reading the message, he heard the sound of the door opening. Haisu and her friend stepped inside, and her friend called out cheerfully, saying that she had brought ice cream for him. Although the air was casual, there was a moment of quiet disbelief in Haisu's friend, Kyunga, when she caught sight of Jaiwon again, taller now, his features more defined, carrying the kind of composure that only time could grant. Her thoughts involuntarily drifted back to a simpler time when he was still a child tugging at her sleeve with schoolbooks in hand, hoping she'd assist him with his homework. Despite his request back then, she would always feign ignorance, insisting that she had never been the studious type and wasn't equipped to help him. Instead of offering guidance, she would often change the subject abruptly, one time diverting the conversation toward recounting her recent trip to Jeju Island, trying to charm her way out of the moment, to which he would usually brush off with a quiet determination to handle it himself. Now, standing in the present, the contrast left her momentarily stunned by how grown up he had become. His presence was no longer that of the boy who once hovered over homework assignments, but of a young man who now carried himself with ease and confidence. As Jaiwon approached, he greeted her with familiar warmth, and though it was meant to be comforting, it left her momentarily frozen. His casual comment, suggesting that nothing had changed and she looked exactly the same, was meant as a light-hearted reflection, but she sensed something deeper in his voice. Realizing her unease, he quickly attempted to dispel the tension, his tone softening as he admitted that he was simply happy to see her again. Watching the interaction unfold, Haisu couldn't help but feel a stir of unease herself. Kyunga, who had previously hinted that she might be blunt or critical when the topic of Jaiwon came up, was now behaving with an unusual gentleness. Her sudden friendliness felt out of place, bordering on performative. Unable to keep her thoughts to herself, Haisu curtly reminded Kyunga that the ice cream they had bought was beginning to melt, an indirect nudge meant to disrupt the atmosphere. Seizing the opportunity, Kyunga invited Jaiwon to join her in eating the ice cream, her voice laced with casual charm, while Haisu looked on with growing uncertainty. Despite the innocent setting, a sense of doubt lingered in her mind, gnawing quietly. Was Kyunga someone she could really trust around Jaiwon? That concern only deepened later when Kyunga found herself alone in Jaiwon's room. Casually observing the photos on his desk and shelves, snapshots of memories, frozen moments that gave away the subtle growth of his life. Her voice carried a playful curiosity as she asked whether he was currently seeing anyone. His response came without hesitation. He wasn't, and he added that he simply preferred the comfort of living with Haisu. Kyunga, never one to let a remark slide without commentary, teased that if he kept on like this, he would eventually turn into a mama's boy. Jaiwon, unbothered, simply shrugged off the remark, stating that it didn't really concern him. After all, he wasn't particularly interested in anyone else anyway. As the quiet conversation between Kyunga and Jaiwon unfolded in the room, something shifted within Kyunga. The pieces were falling into place, and she finally understood the root of Haisu's concern, the subtle, ever-deepening attachment Jaiwon held toward her. With a calm yet thoughtful tone, Kyunga began to explain to Jaiwon that it was natural, especially when young, to feel drawn to someone older. She emphasized that such feelings, though powerful, could often lead to confusion, making it hard to separate genuine connection from something idealized. But Jaiwon's response came with the firm clarity of someone who had already sorted through his emotions. He didn't seem confused. He didn't hesitate. He stated simply and directly that he felt happiest whenever he was with Haisu. That was all there was to it. It wasn't about projection or misunderstanding, it was the feeling itself that he held onto, and he had no desire to be apart from her. Kyunga was taken aback. The conviction in his voice was far from naive, it was grounded, sincere, and unshaken. At that moment, she realized that this was far more serious than she had anticipated. With this newfound urgency, she stood up and walked to the door. As she opened it, she found Haisu standing just outside, hesitating at the threshold as if unsure whether to come in. Without revealing much of the conversation, Kyunga asked Haisu to step out just for an hour and come back later. Haisu, puzzled and a little suspicious, questioned the need for such secrecy, insisting that whatever was being discussed could be done with her present. However, Kyunga was firm. She stated that Haisu's presence was distracting for the moment, giving no room for argument as she gently but purposefully closed the door behind her and turned the lock. As the lock clicked into place, Kyunga's expression shifted into one of quiet resolve. She wasn't doing this out of malice, but out of fear that if left unspoken, something precious might be lost again. She thought of the past, of the people Haisu had already lost. To Kyunga, this was her chance to step in before things spiraled beyond repair. Within the room, she turned back to Jiwon, no longer in the role of a playful friend but of someone trying to intervene. Her goal now was to challenge his certainty, not to mock or belittle it, but to put it to the test. She needed him to see that if his happiness was so deeply tied to Haisu alone, then perhaps he hadn't yet opened himself to the wider world, to other connections or possibilities. In her heart, she hoped she could still redirect what felt like a dangerous path, that she could prove to him that his happiness didn't have to begin and end with just one person, even someone as important as Haisu. While Kyunga remained behind closed doors, trying to reach through the layers of emotion and certainty that surrounded Jiwon's attachment to Haisu, the woman in question sat alone on a gently creaking swinging chair just outside, tucked within the quiet corners of the neighborhood. Her eyes stayed fixed on the screen of her phone, the message she had sent moments ago still visible, her contact details forwarded to the agency she had come across earlier on a forum, a decision made on impulse. Driven by something she couldn't fully explain. She told herself it was simply curiosity, that there was no harm in exploring new opportunities. But as she tapped her fingers anxiously against her knee, she realized it wasn't curiosity that had driven her, it was restlessness. A strange and growing impatience was clawing at her chest, though she had no clear reason why. It wasn't like Kyunga to overstep. It wasn't like Jiwon to hide things from her. And yet, something about the locked door and the private conversation unsettled her in a way she couldn't dismiss. After a few more moments of resisting the urge, Haisu stood up from the swinging chair. She told herself that an hour must have passed already, and whatever they needed to talk about would surely be over by now. With that reasoning, she walked back toward the house, determination quiet but firm in her steps. Inside the room, Kyunga and Jiwon were finishing up a workout, one meant to test his limits, challenge his focus, and push his body and mind away from his emotional dependence. It had been more than just exercise, it was Kyunga's method of breaking through, showing him that there were other forms of happiness, other ways to feel alive. She told him not to mention what they had just done, to keep it between the two of them for now. But before Jiwon could respond, the door creaked open. Haisu stepped inside, her presence immediate and disarming. Her eyes scanned the room, Jiwon slightly flushed, Kyunga with her arms crossed and posture stiff. Something in the air felt different, charged. With a neutral tone edged in subtle suspicion, Haisu asked what they were doing. Both Kyunga and Jiwon were caught off guard by Haisu's sudden return, the door swinging open before either had the chance to compose themselves. The tension that hung in the room was swiftly replaced by a startled silence as Haisu's eyes darted between them, curious and mildly suspicious. Kyunga, ever quick to regain her footing, forced a nervous smile as she searched for a believable explanation. Her gaze landed on the small puddle of melted ice cream on the table nearby, an oversight that unexpectedly came to her rescue. Feigning casualness, Kyunga pointed it out and explained that Jiwon had accidentally spilled the ice cream earlier and had to clean himself off, hence the delay and the state they were in. Picking up on her cue, Jiwon nodded and confirmed her story without adding much detail, his tone carefully neutral. Satisfied that the story held up, Kyunga quickly shifted the conversation, asking if Haisu was all right. She gently acknowledged that Haisu must have come back out of concern and reassured her that there was no longer anything to worry about. With a lightness she had clearly rehearsed in her mind, Kyunga added that Jiwon had probably been too focused on his studies to properly understand certain emotional matters, but she had taken the time to talk things through with him. Now that he had a better grasp of things, she was confident the situation would improve going forward. She concluded with a subtle suggestion, encouraging Haisu to continue acting normally around Jiwon, not to treat him any differently than she always had. With that, Kyunga gathered her things and took her leave, offering Haisu a warm smile on her way out. Left standing in the quiet room, Haisu was filled with a mixture of gratitude and relief. While part of her still harbored unease about the nature of Kyunga's intervention, she couldn't deny the sense of reassurance she now felt. Whatever had happened behind that locked door, it seemed Kyunga had handled it with her usual tact and strength. Elsewhere, in a university lecture hall bustling with students settling into their seats, casual chatter filled the air. Among them was Suryan, seated beside a friend who was venting about a recent confrontation with an upperclassman. The frustration in her voice was unmistakable as she lamented the fallout and the awkward silence that had followed the fight, leaving the two of them barely on speaking terms. A few rows ahead, Jiwon sat with his friend Sungbik in the front row, his attention buried in a book. Sunbeek, spotting Soohyun just behind them, nudged Jaewon lightly and whispered if he should go greet her. Without lifting his gaze, Jaewon replied softly that Soohyun was in the middle of a conversation and wouldn't appreciate being interrupted. Meanwhile, Soohyun's friend continued her one-sided monologue, rambling now about her laundry habits with her older brother. She complained that he never washed his clothes properly and constantly wore inappropriate outfits around the house. The mundane familiarity of her words struck something in Jaewon, the imagery cutting too close to his own private thoughts. Seemingly without warning, he rose from his seat mid-lecture, muttering to Sunbeek that he had just remembered something urgent and had to leave. Sunbeek looked up in surprise, protesting that Jaewon was bailing on him after hyping up their post-class plans to hit the game room. But Jaewon was already on his way out, not bothering to look back. As the door closed behind him, Soohyun turned to Sunbeek, puzzled, and asked if Jaewon had just left without attending the lecture. Sunbeek shrugged, still mildly annoyed, and responded that Jaewon had said he had some urgent business to take care of. At home, Jaewon moved about with an easy rhythm, assuming he had the place to himself. As he approached the laundry area, a mundane but necessary task in his mind, he wondered aloud if Haesoo had gone out. Seeing that the laundry was still unattended, a faint sense of relief crossed his face. He was glad to have gotten there first. Glancing over the pile, he muttered to himself about how surprised he still was that women seemed to dislike laundry to such an extent, a thought clearly influenced by past experiences and perhaps the conversation from the lecture earlier. However, his sense of calm was abruptly shattered by the sudden sound of someone behind him. Turning quickly, his eyes widened as he saw Haesoo standing just a few steps away. She had been there all along. Haesoo, unfazed by his surprise, smiled gently and explained that she had come home early because she wanted to have dinner with him. She mentioned she was planning to make curry his favorite and asked if that would be okay. Caught off guard but visibly pleased, Jaewon responded that it was fine, adding that he would come over after he finished the laundry. Later that evening, Haesoo sat quietly in her room, her thoughts unsettled. The moment in the laundry room replayed in her mind, not because of what was said, but because of what she sensed beneath the surface. Something in Jaewon's reaction, in his behavior, continued to gnaw at her. As she sat there, her phone buzzed beside her. Reaching for it, she saw that it was a message from the agency she had contacted earlier through an anonymous forum. The message was concise but direct. They had seen her post and believed they understood what she was dealing with. They expressed a willingness to help and provided further details for a meeting. Haesoo stared at the screen, her fingers trembling slightly as she considered the implications. She wondered whether this agency could truly help unravel the complicated feelings and blurred boundaries surrounding Jaewon. Was it naive to hope for a solution through strangers? By the next morning, she found herself behind the wheel of her car, heading toward the address she had been given. Her grip on the steering wheel was firm, her expression unreadable. Doubt lingered. Was this a reckless move or a necessary step forward? Despite not knowing exactly what to expect, she had no better alternatives, and for now that was enough. Eventually, the tall facade of Grand Haight came into view. The building stood polished and imposing, its reputation preceding it. As Haesoo approached the entrance of the room, a quiet uncertainty settled over her. She hesitated just before reaching the door, her mind weighed down by unease. She had no idea what kind of person awaited her on the other side, and for a moment, the thought of turning back felt like a reasonable option. Her hand lingered near the doorknob, but before she could act on her hesitation, the door opened. A woman stood in the doorway, her expression marked by mild surprise upon seeing Haesoo. Without waiting for formalities, she remarked on Haesoo's unexpected arrival, wondering aloud why she hadn't been informed beforehand. Haesoo, still processing the shift in atmosphere, quietly stated that she had just arrived. With a casual wave, the woman invited her in. Even as she stepped inside, Haesoo's apprehension did not subside. She glanced around and hesitated by the threshold, voicing her concern about whether it was really all right for them to speak there. The woman, however, responded with a dry reassurance, saying she had no intention of harming her and again gestured for her to come in. Reluctantly, Haesoo followed and took a seat on the sofa. As they settled into the quiet room's quiet, the woman poured them drinks, mentioning that she had thought it would be difficult to have a proper conversation outside, so she had arranged this private setting instead. Without delay, Haesoo brought up the reason for her visit. She reminded the woman of her claim that there was supposedly a solution to the problem weighing on her. The woman responded calmly, explaining that many people had come to her with similar concerns and that, despite how overwhelming the issue might have seemed at first, it had actually been surprisingly easy to resolve. She hinted that the answer was just within reach and gestured toward a nearby room, suggesting Haesoo take a look. Something about the suggestion made Haesoo pause. A faint sense of unease crept into her chest, and though she couldn't shake the bad feeling, she reminded herself of her purpose. This was for Jiwon. Drawing in a breath, she opened the door. What met her eyes, however, was entirely unexpected. A workout session was in progress inside the room. Disbelief flickered across her face. Without uttering a word, she backed away and promptly left, her steps swift and resolute. This was not what she had come for, and certainly not what she had envisioned for Jiwon. By the time evening fell, a heavy rain blanketed the city. Back at the apartment, Jiwon was quietly tending to the laundry indoors, carefully spreading out the damp clothes. The sound of a sudden thud interrupted the rhythm of his work, drawing his attention toward the hallway. There, sprawled on the floor, was Haesoo. Alarmed, he rushed over and quickly helped her up. It didn't take long to realize she had been drinking. Her movements were sluggish, her words slightly slurred. Supporting her carefully, he led her into her room. Once there, Haesoo murmured something that caught him off guard. She expressed that perhaps they should no longer live together. Her voice, though soft, carried a firm conviction. She mentioned having looked at a few places earlier that day and declared her intention to move out and live on her own. Jiwon, still trying to understand the sudden turn of events, asked why she would say such a thing. Her response was quiet, filled with guilt. She confessed that their living arrangement may have held him back, that because they were always together, he no longer seemed interested in connecting with anyone else. She feared she had unintentionally ruined his chance at something more. Later that same night, Jiwon found himself outside Kyunga's apartment. The rain hadn't let up, soaking him as he stood at her door. When she opened it and saw him, her eyes widened in surprise, concerned by his unexpected visit. She asked what had brought him there in such weather and if something had happened. Without pressing him for details, she urged him to wash up first, saying they could talk afterwards. But Jiwon, still damp from the rain and with emotions running high, looked at her and instead suggested that they work out. Kyunga stood frozen for a moment, startled by the unusual request. Her instinct was to remind him that she was Haesoo's friend, that there were boundaries she shouldn't cross. But before she could articulate any of this, Jiwon spoke again, his voice steady but faintly tinged with desperation. He told her he was fully aware of her connection to Haesoo, that it was precisely why he had come. In his mind, she was the only person he could think of at that moment, someone who might understand the situation even partially and offer the kind of support he couldn't find elsewhere. Still met with silence, Jiwon took a step back, realizing he may have overstepped. He apologized quietly for showing up so late, his posture already turning toward the door. But before he could leave, Kyunga stopped him. She asked where he thought he was going at such a late hour, especially with the rain pouring down outside. Her tone softened as she told him to wash up first, assuring him that she would wait. Later, alone in her room, Kyunga sat on the edge of her bed, her thoughts restless. She replayed his words over and over in her mind. Something had clearly happened, something that had shaken him enough to come to her. She couldn't help but reflect on her own actions, how she had spoken to Haesoo recently, whether her frustration had been misplaced, or whether it had been her gesture of support for Jiwon the other day that had tangled her further into this complicated web. She wasn't sure how she had ended up here, caught between them, but now that she was, the weight of it began to press down on her. When Jiwon returned, freshly showered and changed, she looked at him and quietly said that she understood. His expression, the tremble just beneath his calm surface, told her everything. He didn't look well, he looked tired, unmoored, shaken in a way she hadn't seen before. She admitted that after what happened the last time, she felt partially responsible too. Without saying more, she stood up, prepared herself, and together they began the workout session. After they finish a workout session, Kyunga was glad that it's over and was about to go wash up, but Jiwon claims that he wants them to do another session of workout, which she was surprised by. She tries to explain that it's hard to do 2 workout sessions in a row, but Jiwon claims that it's okay as he even felt more energetic than before, to which they proceed to another session of workout. As the workout session wound down and the tension in the room gradually eased, with a hint of hesitation but a growing sense of familiarity, she remarked that he actually looked better without his glasses, asking if he had ever considered not wearing them. The comment, casual on the surface, carried with it a quiet curiosity, perhaps even an unexpected tenderness that neither of them acknowledged directly. By the following morning, Haesoo lay motionless on her bed, the weight of last night's memories surfacing in fragmented flashes. Her words, heavy with finality and emotion, played back in her head. For a moment, she opened her eyes abruptly, uncertain whether it had all been real or just a strange dream born of exhaustion and drink. But as the clarity of morning settled in, the truth followed with it. Meanwhile, Jiwon was already on his way home, the cool morning air brushing against his skin. He felt lighter, as though the burden he had been carrying had briefly loosened its grip. When he entered the apartment, he was surprised to see Haisu already up. She looked at him, her tone casual as she asked if he was just getting back from school. He hesitated, then mentioned that he had thought it was a public holiday, only to realize too late that he had forgotten. Haisu, unfazed, smiled faintly and said it was all right, she had taken the day off as well. In the kitchen, she busied herself with preparing breakfast. As she stirred the pot, a quiet thought crossed her mind. Human beings are such delusional creatures. From across the room, Jaiwan looked at her, sensing an odd peace in the moment and telling himself that maybe things really were getting better. But as soon as the thought formed, he felt a quiet alarm. That kind of thinking, he knew, was often the most dangerous because it was when one believed things were fine that the cracks started spreading unnoticed. Haisu called out to him from the stove, saying the stew was almost ready and asking if she should wait for him to finish his rice before serving it. He responded with a simple yes, trying to match her normalcy. Yet beneath that surface, his thoughts were tangled. He had assumed that everything would improve after the emotional release he experienced with Kyunga, but instead, he found his mind even more clouded. The sense of freedom he had gained had only made him more aware of the tensions around him and inside himself. He stared off, lost in thought, until Haisu's voice cut through the haze. She looked surprised and delighted, noting that he had eaten all the beans. He quickly replied that they were delicious, to which she smiled brightly, saying he seemed more like an adult now. The lightness in her tone was genuine, and she followed it by mentioning her plans to do a deep cleaning of the apartment for the first time in a while. She asked if he would help her, and he agreed without hesitation. Together, they moved through the apartment, cleaning side by side. Yet even as he dusted and swept, Jaiwan's focus drifted. His movements were mechanical, his mind caught in a quiet tug-of-war. He realized with growing concern that if this dissonance continued, it would eventually become a serious problem. He needed something to re-anchor himself, perhaps a new focus or shared tasks that required more than just surface cooperation. Haisu interrupted his thoughts again, this time handing him a piece of dirty cloth and asking if he could wash it. He took it in his hands, his pulse quickening slightly. The simplicity of the task somehow made him nervous, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the day might still hold unexpected turns. He quietly wondered if he would be able to make it through without anything slipping out of place. As Jaiwan paused mid-motion, visibly flustered, Haisu glanced at him curiously, asking what was wrong. He quickly brushed it off, claiming he had only been wondering if there was anything else he could help with. Without waiting for a response, he took the damp cloth and excused himself, promising to be right back. Left alone for a moment, Haisu tilted her head slightly, puzzled. She couldn't quite place it, but something about the way he was acting struck her as unusual. Her hand subconsciously brushed across her face as she wondered if there might be something on it, something out of place that was making him behave so nervously. In the bathroom, Jaiwan stood over the sink, watching the cloth soak in the cold water. He let out a slow, quiet breath, frustrated with himself. These were the moments that always threw him off, simple, ordinary moments that somehow felt too close, too fragile. He knew he needed to clear his head and stay focused. Just concentrate on the task like always. That was all he had to do. He returned and handed the cloth back to her, asking in a more composed tone if there was anything else she needed him to do. Haisu, casually taking the cloth, remarked that it had been a while since she last cleaned the floor, and there was quite a bit of dust buildup underneath. Jaiwan nodded, though inwardly he felt his focus slipping again. He caught himself and gave his head a slight shake, forcing the thoughts away. He then offered to clean the bathroom instead, telling himself it was best to put some distance between them, just for now. But even with his attempt to avoid proximity, the nature of their task didn't allow for much separation. Cleaning, as mundane as it was, required them to cross paths frequently, handing each other tools, adjusting furniture, or navigating tight corners. Despite his efforts to stay detached, there were numerous small moments when he had no choice but to assist her, lifting boxes or holding things steady. Each time she thanked him, her tone casual and sincere, he found himself more unsettled. It was a precarious balance, and he could feel himself inching closer to his limits. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the apartment gleamed. The air was still, quiet, and tinged with the golden hue of evening. Jaiwan slumped into a chair, his back aching slightly, and remarked with genuine disbelief how exhausting it had been just to clean the place. Haisu chuckled and thanked him warmly for all his help, her expression relaxed and cheerful. She then asked if he wanted to shower first, but he declined, telling her to go ahead and wash up first. For a moment, he allowed himself a quiet sigh of relief. The cleaning was done, and it had gone well, more or less. Just as he began to think the ordeal was over, Haisu turned back to him, her tone light but tired. She mentioned that her shoulders were sore from the effort and asked if he could help massage them. Caught off guard, Jaiwan hesitated. Still, without a word, he moved behind her and began to press gently at her shoulders. His hands were careful, unsure. Though he tried to stay calm, his heart betrayed him with every flustered breath. Haesoo, still seated on the floor, let out a soft sigh of relief and smiled faintly, thanking Jiwon for the massage. With a tired yet genuine expression, she remarked how glad she was to have him around, how comforting it was, simply having him there with her. The words barely settled in the air when Jiwon suddenly stood up. Without turning to face her, he told her not to ask him for something like that again. His voice was quiet but firm, layered with restraint. He explained that it was difficult for him, too difficult, and because of that, he didn't like it. Before she could say anything in return, he added that he was going out to meet a friend and walked out, leaving Haesoo stunned by his abruptness and unsure of what had just gone wrong. Later that evening, Jiwon was seen at Kyunga's apartment. The room was dimly lit, the television screen casting soft shadows as it played a segment from a fashion program. Kyunga appeared on screen, confidently introducing the dress she was wearing and explaining its design details with practiced poise. From where he sat, Jiwon watched her intently, visibly calmer than he had been earlier. He remarked with a hint of admiration that she really sounded intelligent when she was working. Kyunga, catching the comment, turned her head slightly and looked at him with narrowed eyes, half amused, half annoyed. She shot back, asking if that meant he thought she wasn't usually like that. If he was here just to tease her, she told him he should go bother Haesoo instead. But Jiwon shook his head lightly, his expression more serious now. He explained that, at least for the time being, he needed to maintain some distance from Haesoo. Curious and slightly concerned, Kyunga asked what was going on. Jiwon, struggling to find the right words, admitted that being near Haesoo made his feelings waver. The honesty of his confession caught her off guard, and to her own surprise, she found herself a little excited by his vulnerability. With a light chuckle, she teased that she might actually have a knack for parenting after all. Still, she reminded him that Haesoo might worry if he just disappeared, so he should avoid leaving without saying anything. Jiwon nodded in understanding and said he had originally planned to ask his seniors or friends if they could let him stay over for a while. However, it quickly became clear that he had misread Kyunga's earlier words. She had only intended to offer him a place to rest temporarily, but not necessarily as a long-term refuge. Still, seeing his earnestness, she decided to play along at least for the night and told him to remember the passcode to her door just in case he ever needed it. A few days later, within the sleek confines of a meeting room, Jiwoo stood confidently at the front, guiding the team through a detailed presentation on a new business proposal. His voice carried the weight of professionalism, but amidst the attentive nods and scribbled notes, Haesoo appeared visibly detached. Though seated upright with her notepad open, her eyes kept flickering toward her phone screen, betraying the pretense of engagement. Her thoughts drifted elsewhere, specifically to the lingering silence from Jiwon, whose absence had grown more conspicuous with each passing day. The sudden distance he had placed between them was beginning to feel deliberate, and as the moments ticked by, she quietly questioned whether she had unknowingly made a mistake that drove him away. Just then, her phone buzzed, lighting up with Jiwon's name on the screen. With barely concealed urgency, she rose from her seat, offering a brief apology under the guise of an important call that demanded her immediate attention, promising to return shortly. However, upon answering, it was not Jiwon's voice she heard but that of Sungbik, who politely introduced himself as Jiwon's friend. He explained that Jiwon had asked him to call in his stead as he was tied up in a project meeting and would be running late. Haesoo, hiding her surprise, acknowledged the message with a neutral tone, noting how Jiwon seemed to be increasingly preoccupied these days. Elsewhere, far removed from any meeting, Jiwon was seen casually chatting with a fellow student with no sign of urgency. As Sungbik handed him back his phone, he couldn't help but comment on Jiwon's recent aloofness, jokingly accusing him of having had a fallout with his mother, especially unusual given Jiwon's typically affectionate mama's boy persona. Jiwon, maintaining his composure, dismissed the notion, insisting that his mind was simply overloaded with work. Still, a hint of unease clung to his words as he admitted that certain matters, though mostly resolved, continued to weigh on him. In an effort to lighten the mood, he suggested they go out for a drink, which caught Sungbik off guard, more so when Jiwon casually mentioned the possibility of inviting a girl to join them. Later that evening, the setting shifted to a lively bar filled with the low hum of music and the clinking of glasses. Sungbik sat at a corner table, his curiosity piqued as Suryan arrived, her presence drawing an excited reaction from him. Just behind her came a friend, someone Sungbik had never seen before, prompting him to nudge Jiwon with a half-whispered question about the unfamiliar woman. Jiwon, appearing nonchalant, simply stated that he had made an open invitation in the group chat and hadn't kept track of who might actually show up. As the evening unfolded, yet another familiar face entered, their senior from university, who jovially declared that he had come to treat his juniors to drinks. Without hesitation, he pulled up a chair and made himself part of the gathering. Amidst the growing crowd, the overlapping conversations, and the laughter spilling over the table, Sungbeek leaned back slightly, scanning the scene in bewilderment. It dawned on him, with a mix of amusement and disbelief, that Jiwon had somehow orchestrated what felt like an impromptu mixer party without fully intending to. At the bar, amidst the clinking of glasses and the dim buzz of casual conversation, Suyin's friend, Sujin, sat stiffly in her seat, her expression betraying a growing sense of regret. She had followed Suyin here on a whim, caught up in the spontaneity of the invitation, but now she found herself wishing she had stayed home. The atmosphere felt off from the start. What was supposed to be a casual get-together had somehow morphed into a strange, unbalanced gathering. The venue itself felt inappropriate, given that Jiwon, the supposed organizer, was someone known to avoid alcohol entirely and yet had inexplicably chosen a bar as the setting. To make matters worse, Byundu, their senior, was growing increasingly persistent in encouraging Suyin to drink, all while Sungbeek, a known heavy drinker, had already gone through several rounds. But what unsettled Sujin the most wasn't the alcohol or even Byundu's thinly veiled attempts at flirtation, it was Suyin's composure. She remained seated among the men without a hint of discomfort, as though the situation was completely normal. Sujin couldn't understand it. Despite her mounting unease, she couldn't bring herself to leave, unwilling to abandon Suyin in such questionable company. Eventually, resignation took hold and she reached for a drink herself, thinking it might help her endure the evening. Not long after, Byundu noticed her taking a sip and seized the moment to suggest they play a game together rather than sit around drinking in silence. His tone was light, but Sujin saw through it instantly. Her response came sharp and clear. She told him outright that she understood exactly what he was trying to do and that she would be keeping a close watch on him. Byundu, slightly taken aback, quickly tried to brush off her suspicions, insisting that his only goal was to ensure the juniors had a good time. Just then, Jiwon chimed in, stating that he too wanted to play, his energy drawing Suyin's interest as well, who agreed with a surprising eagerness. Sujin stared at them both, momentarily stunned by their sudden enthusiasm, wondering if she was the only one in the group who couldn't find anything enjoyable about the gathering. Around them, empty bottles continued to accumulate, forming a small collection at the edge of the table. Amid the laughter, Byundu made a casual remark that Sungbeek had once again lost the game and with a smirk questioned whether he had ever actually understood how to play. When Sungbeek looked visibly drunk, Byundu turned to Jiwon and asked him to take the other man outside for a moment to sober up. Jiwon leaned in and offered to take Sungbeek's drink if he couldn't manage it, but Sungbeek stubbornly shook his head and downed it himself. Byundu, visibly annoyed by the repetitive outcome, muttered that it wasn't any fun if the same people kept getting caught. To liven things up, he asked a question that triggered a slurred, nonsensical answer from Sungbeek, prompting an exasperated Byundu to swat him lightly on the head and demand that he pull himself together. Recognizing the situation was spiraling, Jiwon helped Sungbeek out of the bar for some air. Outside, the night air did little to sober Sungbeek, who swayed slightly as he turned to Jiwon with an apologetic look. He asked if he had ruined the mood and confessed that he always became awkward and tongue-tied around women, feeling like his presence was nothing but a letdown. Jiwon, however, was quick to reassure him, saying that he had actually enjoyed himself and that Sungbeek's clumsy joke had genuinely made him laugh. As they stood there, a taxi pulled up to the curb. Sungbeek watched as Jiwon climbed in, murmured something unintelligible, and disappeared into the night. Not long after, Jiwon arrived at a quiet apartment, the light from the hallway spilling softly across the floor. Inside, Kyunga was asleep on the couch, her phone clutched loosely in her hand as though she had drifted off while waiting. For a moment, Jiwon hesitated, debating whether to wake her or carry her to her bedroom. Meanwhile, back at her apartment, Haisu sat on the edge of her bed, phone in hand, her fingers hesitating over the screen as she tried once again to call Jiwon. The line didn't go through, just as it hadn't the last few times. A quiet frustration began to build in her chest, but more than that, a growing sense of unease. Jiwon had been unusually late every day for the past week, and tonight he hadn't come back at all. It was unlike him. He was never the type to stay out without notice, never the kind to leave someone wondering. She stared at the screen in silence, her thoughts spiraling as she questioned whether something might have happened, or worse, if something had already begun to change between them. Her thoughts returned to earlier in the week, to a moment that hadn't sat right with her. They had been cleaning the house together, an ordinary enough activity, but she had sensed something different in him, a kind of distance, quiet but unmistakable. He hadn't spoken much, his responses brief, his eyes often elsewhere. At the time, she had brushed it off as fatigue, but now it came back to her with unsettling clarity. And then, like a puzzle piece slipping into place, she remembered the dream, or what she thought was a dream, where she had told Jiwon she was thinking of moving out and living alone. It dawned on her that it hadn't been a dream at all. She had actually said those words out loud. She didn't know what compelled her to say it or if she meant it fully, but now she feared he had taken it seriously and that perhaps it had created a quiet wall between them. Elsewhere, Jiwon stood in the small, cluttered living room of Kyungga's apartment, his body stiff with hesitation as he considered doing a bit of working out. Turning slightly, he saw Kyungga shifting awake on the couch, her eyes half open as she slowly sat up, still drowsy from sleep. Her voice was barely above a whisper edged with confusion as she looked at him and asked what he was doing. Jiwon, caught off guard, stiffened with surprise, unsure of what to say, the moment suspended between them in the dim light of the quiet apartment. Kyungga, having regained her composure after waking up to find Jiwon moving around in the dark, gave him a light scolding, telling him to stop fooling around and not to disturb her rest like that again. Though her tone was firm, she couldn't shake the feeling that he looked oddly guilty, almost as if her mild reprimand had weighed on him more than intended. Watching his reaction, she began to wonder if perhaps she had been too harsh, if maybe he had just needed an outlet for something weighing on his mind. A moment later, softening her stance, she told him that she was going to sleep now and gently suggested that he go inside to get some rest as well. She added that he could take the bed for the night, insisting she'd just sleep on the couch. Despite the offer, Jiwon found himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling in the dimly lit room. Whether it was the alcohol lingering in his system or the unrest in his thoughts, sleep simply wouldn't come. His mind drifted through a fog of memories, doubts, and words unsaid. He shifted restlessly beneath the blanket, his eyes occasionally flicking to the closed door as if expecting something or someone to appear. Meanwhile, in the living room, Kyungga was also struggling to fall back asleep. Perhaps it was the sudden interruption earlier, or maybe it was the awareness that someone else was now in her space, someone who carried with him a tension she couldn't quite read. Eventually, the soft creak of a door opening broke the silence. Jiwon emerged from the room, his footsteps quiet as he padded across the floor. He had given up trying to sleep. The silence in the room didn't soothe him, it only made the unease louder. As Kyungga wasn't asleep either. Kyungga found herself in disbelief as she realized Jiwon was once again preparing to begin his workout right there in the living room, just as he had done before. The situation felt strangely familiar, yet something about it felt markedly different this time. Back then, she had gone along with it under the belief that she was doing it for the sake of both Jiwon and Haesoo, for their relationship, their stability. But now, with Haesoo no longer part of the immediate picture and the air between her and Jiwon carrying an unspoken tension, she questioned what exactly this moment meant. It no longer felt like something she was merely overseeing or enduring for someone else's sake. As Jiwon moved with quiet determination, beginning to stretch and ease into his routine, Kyungga stepped forward, halting him with a few words, her voice tinged with concern. She reminded him of the time, insisting it was already late and urging him to go to sleep. But Jiwon, with a weary look in his eyes, explained that he wanted nothing more than to rest, yet he simply couldn't fall asleep unless he first allowed his mind and body to wind down through movement. Despite her reluctance, Kyungga could see the sincerity in him. He wasn't doing this out of restlessness or whim. He was trying, in his own quiet way, to calm something unresolved within himself. And so, when he insisted on continuing, even inviting her to join him slightly just to get through it, she found herself unable to turn him away. She hesitated at first, but eventually let the moment unfold. As the workout began between them, Kyungga's thoughts drifted once more to Haesoo. A pang of guilt stirred in her chest, realizing how easily these private, late-night moments could be misinterpreted and how hard it would be to explain them if taken at face value. Still, she told herself that this wasn't about anything else. This was about helping Jiwon find a bit of peace, about allowing him the chance to sleep. Kyungga had been patiently enduring Jiwon's relentless energy for a while, observing how immersed he was in what he was doing. It became increasingly clear that he had no intention of stopping anytime soon. She knew she had a full day ahead at work, and the thought of showing up sleep-deprived was far from appealing. With this in mind, she made it a point to draw his attention, gently reminding him of the time and urging him, albeit with some firmness, to bring his enthusiastic efforts to a close. She allowed him to continue with his workout session. Time passed slowly but surely. Eventually, as the early morning hues began to stretch across the sky, Jiwon reached a point of contentment and finally brought his workout session to a halt. Sensing the brief silence that followed, Kyungga took the opportunity to pull herself together. She rose, preparing mentally and physically for the day ahead, intending to start breakfast and get herself ready for work. But just as she thought the moment of peace had arrived, she became aware of Jaewon's lingering presence and his undiminished eagerness. Despite her subtle attempts to dissuade him, urging him to let her go about her morning routine, Jaewon seemed deaf to her reluctance and continued pressing forward, driven by the same stubborn energy that had carried him through the night. Kyunga, now more exasperated than surprised, was about to protest more seriously when the unexpected sound of the doorbell echoed through the apartment. Seeing an opportunity for temporary escape, she quickly announced her intent to answer the door, assuming it was the delivery she had scheduled. Reluctantly, Jaewon stepped aside just enough to let her walk away, though he remained physically close, still pursuing her attention even as she moved to the entrance. As she opened the door, with Jaewon unyieldingly hovering behind her, a creeping sense of anxiety surged through her. The possibility of someone seeing them in such an awkward and compromising situation flashed through her mind. Before she could fully brace herself, she heard her name being called out with unmistakable familiarity. The voice belonged to none other than Haesoo. Suyeon was at home that morning, preparing to step out when an unexpected encounter in the living room caused her to pause. As she descended the hallway and entered the room, she was surprised to see her father seated there. His presence was unusual at that hour, considering his typically early departure for work. The surprise on her face was mirrored by the subtle disapproval in his eyes as he regarded her with a stern expression that carried unspoken expectations. He observed her appearance and, sensing her sluggish demeanor, commented on her seemingly late start to the day. Inwardly, she wondered why he had not already left for the newsroom where his demanding responsibilities as a seasoned journalist usually kept him occupied from the early hours. The brief silence between them was quickly filled by a more probing inquiry from him as he shifted the conversation toward the events of the previous night. With a careful tone, he questioned her about her late return home, subtly masking his concern behind a veil of paternal authority. Suyeon, unwilling to delve into specifics, gave a vague explanation about spending time with friends. Her father, however, was not easily convinced. Years of investigative reporting had sharpened his instincts, and he could tell from her hesitance that she was not being entirely truthful. His suspicion grew, and he voiced his belief that she had instead been with a man. She didn't offer a rebuttal, and her silence only seemed to confirm his assumptions. With a deep sigh, her father shifted from interrogation to caution. He revealed that troubling rumors had begun to circulate, whispers about her behavior that could easily gain traction if given attention. As the election season loomed near, tensions in their household had grown, not just because of political fervor, but because of the delicate nature of his profession. His investigative work, particularly aimed at uncovering damaging truths about rival candidates, required a careful public image both for himself and his family. The mere possibility of scandal, even if born from exaggeration, could be weaponized in the volatile world of media and politics. It was with this in mind that he urged her to remain inconspicuous, to avoid doing anything that might draw unnecessary attention. He stressed the importance of maintaining a quiet and composed presence, likening it to that of a mouse, silent, cautious, and unseen. Until the elections concluded or until she eventually married and moved into a place of her own, he insisted that she refrain from indulging in any of the behaviors that, in his view, brought her the wrong kind of attention. At that moment, Suyeon could no longer endure the weight of her father's words. The pressure, the criticism, the relentless need to fit into the quiet mold he had crafted for her, each sentence had settled like lead on her chest. Without another glance at him, she turned on her heel and bolted up the stairs, retreating to the only place where she still felt she had a sliver of control, her room. Once inside, she shut the door behind her with a trembling hand as though trying to seal herself off from the world beyond. She began to frantically search through her drawers and shelves until she found her old journal and a pen, the same tools she often turned to when she needed to translate emotion into something tangible. Without pausing, she sat down and began scribbling, listing every action her father had forbidden her to do, each one marked like a crime on a record she didn't remember signing. But the truth was, the more she tried to suppress those impulses, the more suffocated she became, as though each act of obedience slowly drained the oxygen from her lungs. Despite the vastness of the mansion they lived in, with its marble floors and sprawling corridors, she now felt like a ghost wandering through a place where she could never truly be unseen. It became clear that the size of the house only amplified her father's watchful presence. So, she began hiding in the smallest corner she could find, a space not big enough to stretch her limbs, but somehow large enough to hold her thoughts. There, hunched over with pen to paper, she wrote as if the ink itself could create a door. And as she scribbled through her haze of frustration and yearning, a name surfaced in her mind, Jaewon. The moment he appeared in her thoughts, everything she'd been trying to suppress collapsed inwards. Her focus fractured, and the clarity she had while writing was suddenly replaced with a storm of emotion. She couldn't think straight anymore. Elsewhere, in the early stillness of morning at Kyunghwa's house, Hae-soo had shown up unannounced. She arrived with an apologetic expression, explaining that she had something weighing on her mind, something important enough to bring her there on her way to work. Hoping not to intrude too much, she politely asked if she could come inside so they could talk in private. Unbeknownst to her, Jaewon was still inside the house. Upon hearing Hae-soo's familiar voice from the doorway, he froze where he stood. A sudden tension ran through him, and instead of stepping back or making his presence known, he instinctively moved behind Kyunghwa, gripping her gently but tightly, hoping that his body would stay hidden in the narrow sliver of space she occupied. He clung to her like a child caught doing something forbidden, desperate not to be seen. As Hae-soo received no answer, she spoke again, noting her limited time and expressing her wish to speak with Kyunghwa as soon as possible. At that point, Kyunghwa carefully leaned her head out through the barely opened door and informed Hae-soo that now was not a good time. From Kyunghwa's appearance and demeanor, Hae-soo quickly gathered that nothing was seriously wrong. Relieved yet embarrassed by her impulsive visit, she apologized for coming without warning. She told Kyunghwa she would come back another time, then turned to leave. Once the door was shut again, a wave of relief swept through Jaewon. He exhaled, thankful that they had narrowly avoided an uncomfortable discovery. Without saying much, he made his way toward the bedroom, intending to get dressed. Kyunghwa stood quietly for a moment, surprised by the sudden shift in him. His casual attitude, his lack of remorse for what had just nearly occurred, left her stunned. He moved as though nothing had happened, as if there were no emotional weight to their closeness or near exposure. He simply went about his business, explaining with a calm detachment that Hae-soo's tone earlier suggested she might be concerned about him, and so he planned to return home and reach out to her. Later that night, Jaewon returned to Hae-soo's apartment and, after a long day, quietly retreated to the guest room where he now sometimes stayed. As sleep finally began to pull him under, the door creaked open softly. Without knocking or announcing herself, Hae-soo stepped into the dimly lit room. Without Jaewon's knowledge, Hae-soo had joined him for a workout, moving alongside him in the same space, and she allowed herself the quiet thrill of being near him while remaining unnoticed. The following day, as she arrived at work, a subtle shift in her composure became evident. She struggled to maintain focus on even the simplest tasks, her mind drifting off into thoughts she couldn't name, much less explain. She became easily distracted, her eyes often fixed on nothing in particular, and even when her name was called, she would fail to respond until someone physically tapped her shoulder. Only then would she return to the present, startled, offering hurried apologies for her delayed reaction. One such moment occurred when she was informed that the director had been calling for her. Quickly regaining her composure, she apologized for the oversight and with a respectful nod followed the director as he led her to his office. The atmosphere inside the room was calm but carried an undertone of concern. The director, after settling into his chair, began by pointing out the recent inconsistencies in the performance of the second team. He expressed genuine confusion over the sudden decline, as the team had previously maintained a steady pace. His observations were firm but not unkind, and as he questioned what might have caused the downturn, Hae-soo found herself unable to produce any explanation. She sat in silence, weighed down by the realization that she had no justification to offer, only a growing sense of guilt and self-disappointment. The director then shifted the conversation toward her future in the company, stating that unless she was able to stabilize her output and take hold of her path toward an executive position, she would remain in her current standing indefinitely. He noted that her children were thriving and saw no visible reason for her current lack of engagement. Though his words were direct, there was a trace of compassion in his tone, and he gently encouraged her to open up about her burdens before they became too overwhelming to manage. He reminded her that speaking to someone, anyone, could ease the weight she carried. Grateful for his concern, she offered a quiet expression of thanks and took her leave from his office. Seeking a moment of solitude, she made her way to the restroom where the polished silence gave her space to think. As she stood alone, the director's words echoed in her mind. She tried to search within herself for the root of her emotional unrest but found no clear answers. Everything felt clouded, unresolved. Despite the suggestion to talk to someone, the idea of opening up felt impossible. She questioned whether she could bring herself to speak about something she hadn't even come to understand. Ultimately, she dismissed the thought of sharing her concerns with anyone, convinced that it would not lead to relief. It dawned on her that everything seemed to have shifted ever since the boy she had cared for over the years, once just a child needing guidance, had grown into a man. He had begun to regard her differently, no longer with the innocent gaze of a dependent but with the quiet awareness of someone who now saw her as a woman. This subtle transformation in his demeanor had not escaped her, and though no words were exchanged to confirm it, she sensed it in the way he looked at her, in the tension that sometimes lingered in their shared silences. Though they shared no blood ties, the nature of their relationship had always felt familial, structured around responsibility and care. That understanding had anchored her for so long that anything else felt unnatural, something that simply should not be. It was that discomfort, that looming uncertainty, that led her to consider removing herself from the situation entirely. Her solution was to leave, to live alone, and thereby place a physical boundary between them. In a moment of unintended honesty, she had let that plan slip in front of Jiwon, along with other things she hadn't meant to say. Ever since that incident, she had noticed a growing distance in Jiwon. He had started spending more time outside the house, often returning late, and gradually began to stay out overnight with vague explanations. What startled her even more was how he had begun to correct her small things at first, spoken with a coolness she had never heard in his voice before. The gentle, obedient boy she had once known seemed to be slipping away, replaced by someone she was no longer sure she understood. This emotional confusion only deepened her sense of isolation. She thought about confiding in Kyunga, hoping that perhaps a friend might help her make sense of it all, but each time she tried to initiate the conversation, the words caught in her throat. Even her habit of turning to the anonymity of the internet, of venting through quiet posts, no longer brought her comfort. She began to feel that speaking, whether online or in person, was no longer a safe outlet. It was as though the more she tried to explain her emotions, the more complicated everything became. And so, trapped in this internal storm with no clear resolution, she made a decision that was entirely her own. Without discussing it, without asking for advice, she began to act on instinct. She chose to enter his space at a time when he would be unaware, during his sleep, and quietly joined his workouts. Unbeknownst to Haesoo, her quiet plan to join Jiwon during his workouts while he slept had not gone entirely unnoticed. One night, as she moved carefully beside him, convinced that he remained deep in sleep, Jiwon stirred. His eyes fluttered open briefly, catching a faint glimpse of her figure moving in silence. The sight was so unexpected, so unreal in the dim lighting, that his mind refused to process it fully. He chose to believe it was a dream, something his imagination had conjured in the twilight between consciousness and slumber. The possibility of it being real was too disorienting to accept. The following day, seeking some kind of normalcy, Jiwon met up with his friend Sungbik at a casual restaurant. They exchanged small talk and ordered their meals, but before long, Sungbik noticed something unusual, blood trickling from Jiwon's nose. Alarmed, he pointed it out and asked what could have caused it, immediately suspecting that Jiwon hadn't had a proper night's rest. Jiwon, caught off guard and unwilling to share what had actually happened or what he thought might have happened, offered a dismissive explanation. He claimed it must have been due to the fact that he had slept so soundly the night before without a single worry on his mind. But Sungbik wasn't convinced. He knew that nosebleeds didn't come from peaceful sleep. Silently, he reached into his pocket and handed Jiwon a handkerchief, not pressing further but clearly unconvinced by the excuse. Just then, a woman's voice spoke up from behind, expressing concern and asking if perhaps Jiwon had experienced a strange dream or had woken abruptly during the night. As the familiar tone caught Sungbik's attention, he turned to recognize the woman. It was Soojin. He greeted her warmly, surprised by the coincidence of the encounter. Jiwon, however, was momentarily lost in thought. Soojin's comment stirred something in him, reminding him of that moment from the night before. He began to question whether what he had seen, a Haesoo moving beside him as he slept, had truly been a dream. It hadn't felt entirely real, but it hadn't felt false either. Perhaps, he thought, her presence had entered his dream without her knowing, or maybe she had really been there and his body had responded in confusion. Soojin, now seated at their table with her tray of food, continued the conversation with a curious tone. She advised Jiwon to stay awake for as long as possible and only allow himself to sleep when exhaustion overtook him completely, as that sometimes helped ward off some dreams or unsettling experiences. At her suggestion, Jiwon hesitantly asked if doing so would prevent the dreams altogether. It was an innocent enough question, but his voice carried a hint of anxiety. Hearing his question, Soojin's expression shifted slightly, her interest deepening. She hadn't expected him to admit to having strange dreams. There was something in his tone that made her pause, as though the dreams he spoke of weren't ordinary. A subtle silence passed between them as Soojin realized that whatever Jiwon was experiencing at night wasn't as simple as he made it seem. While Jaewon sat quietly beside Soojin and Sungbik at the restaurant table, Sungbik found himself growing increasingly unsettled, not because of anything Jaewon had said, but rather because of how naturally Soojin had slipped into conversation with Jaewon. The ease with which they spoke, the casual tone and quick familiarity, gnawed at him. Unable to hold it in any longer, Sungbik bluntly questioned why Soojin had even chosen to join their table when the restaurant had so many vacant seats. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried an unmistakable edge. In response, Soojin brushed it off lightly, explaining that she had no one else to eat with since Suyeon wasn't around. She insisted on sitting with them, asking Sungbik to tolerate her presence for the time being. Then, catching a flicker of his discomfort, she turned to him again, half joking but half serious, and asked if her presence was making him uncomfortable. Rather than retreat, she simply told him to adjust, as if her joining them was something inevitable. All the while, Jaewon remained quiet. His thoughts had drifted elsewhere. Despite Soojin's words earlier in the day, or perhaps because of them, he found himself preoccupied with what might await him that night. He hoped that by following her advice, staying awake as long as possible until sleep came upon him suddenly, he might avoid another strange and disorienting experience. He didn't want to wake with more unexplained feelings or worse, signs of something he couldn't understand. And that night, when Jaewon returned home, he followed through with the plan. He kept himself awake well into the late hours, resisting the pull of sleep with everything he had. His body grew heavier, his eyes burned with fatigue, and every sound in the quiet house became amplified. Finally, once he had truly reached his limit, he allowed himself to lie down. He tried to clear his mind, hoping that this time he would simply drift off into a peaceful, undisturbed rest. But just as his eyelids began to close and the quiet began to settle around him, something shifted. A soft glow flickered across the room, a pale light, faint but noticeable. It caught Jaewon's attention immediately because he was sure that the lights had been switched off before he lay down. The house was dark, silent, and still. Yet here was this glimmer, an intrusion into the space. Not long after, he became aware of something else, the distinct sense that someone was approaching. Slow, deliberate steps made their way toward his room. It couldn't have been anyone else. Only Haesoo was home and she was supposed to be sleeping. No one else had a key. The realization sent a ripple of unease through him, not out of fear, but confusion. Was he dreaming already? Had sleep come so quickly that he hadn't noticed the transition? Or was he still awake, trapped between consciousness and dream, and the sensations this time felt too vivid, too coherent? He could feel the blanket against his skin, the cool air on his face, the faint hum of night. Everything was real, painfully real. So real, in fact, that he began to doubt the possibility that this was a dream at all. With a quiet breath and slow movement, he forced his eyes open, bracing himself for whatever he might see. What met his gaze, however, was not a figment of sleep nor an illusion. It was Haesoo. She had entered his room. Jaewon eventually came to the realization that what he was experiencing was not a dream. The clarity of that moment struck him with disbelief, particularly when he found himself confronted with the startling truth that Haesoo was actively engaging in a workout routine alongside him. The strangeness of the situation left him uncertain of how to respond. He wrestled with the urge to speak, torn between revealing his awareness and maintaining the illusion of sleep, hoping perhaps that the moment would pass on its own. As the workout intensified and with no other choice, he opened his eyes. In doing so, he instantly knew that Haesoo must have noticed he was awake. Feeling overwhelmed by the unexpected moment, he attempted to bring it to a halt by asking her to stop. However, Haesoo remained resolute in her actions, undeterred by his words. She continued the session until its natural conclusion, leaving Jaewon stunned. It had never occurred to him that she would take such bold initiative without hesitation. Afterwards, she settled beside him and he slowly rose to a sitting position on the bed. He voiced his disapproval. Yet Haesoo refused to relent, calmly asserting her intention to continue regardless of his reaction. Her defiance deeply unsettled Jaewon, who struggled to understand her sudden shift in behavior. Despite his confusion, Haesoo offered no explanation, showing no concern for the possible consequences of her actions. She appeared entirely unconcerned about how Kyunga or her daughter might perceive the situation if they were to witness it. Her attitude suggested a complete disregard for the boundaries they had previously respected. Jaewon, attempting to appeal to reason, expressed that her choice to perform such activities while he was asleep felt intrusive. However, Haesoo responded with a surprising boldness, indicating that if his preference was for her to engage him while he was fully awake, then she was more than willing to do so. Her reply left Jaewon speechless, unable to process how such a casual remark could carry such weight, especially coming from someone he once believed to be more reserved and rule-bound. The following morning brought further astonishment. Haisu, staying true to her word, initiated the workout again, this time in the early hours of the day. Jaiwon had not anticipated such punctual follow-through. She explained that her busy schedule, which included overtime later that day, left her with no other opportunity. Despite her assertiveness, she still expressed a measure of concern for Jaiwon, briefly wondering whether he would be late for school due to their early morning activities. He, however, dismissed her concern, indicating that he would not be attending school at all that day, attributing his decision entirely to what she had started. This response seemed to please Haisu, as though she found satisfaction in having disrupted his routine in a way that bound him more closely to her. Meanwhile, Jaiwon could not help but reflect on the dramatic change in her behavior. He recalled how she had once been the one to establish rules, to draw firm lines that neither of them were meant to cross. The memory of that structured, rule-oriented version of Haisu stood in sharp contrast to the person now sitting beside him, bold, insistent, and unapologetically forward. However, after giving it considerable thought, Jaiwon began to realize that the life he had recently been leading with Haisu was not something he could truly justify, not by his own values, nor by any measure of self-respect he still held onto. At first, the excitement and novelty had masked the deeper discomfort he now found impossible to ignore. He couldn't deny that, in the past, he had been the one sneaking into Haisu's room under the pretext of sharing a workout session. But everything changed the day Kyunga caught him. Rather than confronting him with anger, she had offered him calm advice, gently urging him to stay away from Haisu's room. In an unexpected turn, she even chose to keep him by her side instead, offering companionship and presence in place of judgment. It was during those moments with Kyunga that Jaiwon came to understand how misguided his feelings for Haisu had been. He realized then that what he believed to be affection or desire was, in truth, a distortion and emotional confusion that had led him down an unhealthy path. Despite that awakening, those lingering emotions for Haisu never fully disappeared. Whenever he was near her, there remained a strange pull and undercurrent of desire that made it difficult to resist her presence. And now, with the situation having shifted completely, he found himself in possession of the very thing he had once chased from a distance: uninterrupted time with Haisu, given freely and without resistance. Before he fully understood what was happening, Jaiwon had grown obsessed, entangled in the physical wrestle they now shared as though it were a necessity rather than a choice. He found himself immersed in a cycle he knew was wrong, yet couldn't seem to break. Their once occasional encounters soon evolved into a daily ritual, one that they adhered to with unspoken commitment. Whether in the quiet hours before leaving the house in the morning or after returning in the late afternoon, their routine persisted. What made the arrangement even more intoxicating was Haisu's unwavering compliance. She never questioned his requests, never refused him. Whatever Jaiwon desired during their so-called workouts, Haisu agreed to without hesitation, seemingly content with the way things were unfolding. As time passed, Jaiwon gradually began to sense that Haisu had grown attached to him in ways he hadn't fully recognized before. It puzzled him that she had kept such feelings hidden for so long, revealing nothing during all the time they had known each other. Only now, in the midst of their increasing closeness, did fragments of her deeper sentiments begin to surface. He wondered if her silence had been intentional, perhaps the result of strict personal boundaries she had imposed on herself long ago. To him, it seemed likely that her behavior had been shaped by a deep-seated sense of discipline or obligation rather than open emotional expression. In their shared routines, particularly during their so-called workouts, the dynamic had become one of unspoken understanding. Jaiwon was always the one to set the pace, the one to dictate what he wanted from their time together. Haisu, without protest, followed his lead. She never argued or refused. Instead, she carried out each request with quiet compliance, as if it were simply part of the arrangement. That night, once the workout was over, Haisu prepared to return to her own room. As she stepped outside, leaving Jaiwon behind, she carried with her a growing confusion. While she had initially convinced herself that all of this, every encounter and every moment of closeness, was simply a means to restore a sense of normalcy between them, something within her had begun to shift. The emotions she felt no longer aligned with her original intention, and she was beginning to sense that the situation was no longer under her full control. She hadn't walked far, just beyond the door, when she suddenly heard a sound coming from Jaiwon's room. Curious, or perhaps concerned, she turned back and opened the door slightly. Inside, Jaiwon was already on his feet. He told her that he was planning to step out for a moment, but when he came out and saw her standing there, he reached for her gently, holding her as if he were preparing to initiate another session. But Haisu quickly reminded him of the agreement she had set, that they would only engage in such activity once per day. She remained firm in that stance, reiterating that it was not possible to continue. Jaiwon, however, challenged her reasoning. With a slight grin and a tone half serious, half teasing, he pointed out that it was already past midnight, technically making it a new day, and therefore fair game to resume. He added that he wanted to confirm something with her, something personal, and insisted she give him an honest answer. Yet, in that moment, Haesoo could not fully grasp what he was getting at. He asked Haesoo how she truly felt whenever they were together, hoping she would finally speak from her heart. But Haesoo, caught off guard by such a sudden and personal question, found herself unable to offer a clear answer. She didn't know what to say, not because the emotions weren't there, but because she wasn't ready to admit them. At the same time, while asking her that question, Jaewon was already preparing to initiate another round of their familiar routine, subtly drawing her back into the same closeness they shared. Deep down, Jaewon suspected that Haesoo was merely pretending, acting as if what they were doing meant nothing more than a temporary arrangement. But he could feel it, the hesitation in her movements, the moments when her gaze lingered longer than necessary, and the emotional pauses that hinted at something deeper. He wanted the truth from her, not just an agreement to participate, but an honest acknowledgement of how she truly felt. Eventually, after a moment of silence weighed heavy between them, Haesoo admitted that she had been afraid. What haunted her wasn't the guilt or shame, but the fear that if she rejected him or distanced herself, something between them would be lost forever. She confessed that her actions had been driven by that fear, the fear of becoming strangers, of losing the bond they once shared. In response, Jaewon quietly revealed that he, too, found it difficult to hide his feelings when she was near. Whenever they were close, something in him stirred, something he couldn't ignore or suppress, no matter how hard he tried. Wanting to dig deeper into her contradictions, Jaewon brought up the words she had told him in the past, how she had justified her actions as being guided by rules and self-imposed promises. He needed to know what had truly driven her to act that way, why she had built those emotional walls, and why she was now beginning to lower them. Within her own thoughts, Haesoo couldn't deny that Jaewon had a point. From the very beginning, her intentions had been to help him to ease what she perceived as emotional and physical restlessness that he might not know how to deal with on his own. She believed that by quietly tending to his needs while he slept, he would eventually lose interest and the emotional tension between them would fade naturally with time. But she now understood that her plan had been flawed from the start. The rules she had set weren't just about boundaries, they were an unfair framework she had created out of fear. In doing so, she had distanced herself from Jaewon even as she stayed physically close to him. She had hoped that, with the passing months, Jaewon would adapt to university life, meet peers of his own age, and grow beyond her, that eventually he would leave these feelings behind as a part of youthful confusion. However, what she didn't anticipate was how much deeper their connection would grow the more they spent time together. Instead of the detachment she had hoped for, each workout brought new questions and unresolved emotions that began to weigh on her more heavily than she expected. She started to realize that perhaps everything shifted the day Jaewon caught her when he had woken up and seen her actions clearly for the first time. That single moment forced her to make a conscious choice, and the consequences of that choice had continued unfolding ever since. Gradually, Haesoo came to a quiet yet unsettling conclusion. A part of her heart had begun to accept, even hope for, a new reality, one in which she stopped resisting and simply allowed herself to be as she was with him. She questioned whether all her earlier efforts to push him away had simply been manifestations of her own anxiety and self-doubt. And so, after much thought, she made a silent decision within herself: she would no longer resist him. If Jaewon, this boy she had once helped raise, who had grown before her eyes into someone she could no longer deny, still wanted her in this way, then she would allow him. Suyeon stood before her classmates, addressing them with a composed and sincere demeanor, acknowledging their collective efforts and the diligence they had shown throughout the day. She expressed her appreciation for their hard work while also offering a gentle reminder that the deadline for their assignment was approaching and might prove difficult to meet. As she shifted her attention to Soojin, she made an effort to check in with her regarding the group project, inquiring whether Soojin was managing well with her assigned team. However, Soojin's uncertainty was evident. She seemed discontent with the group dynamics, particularly disliking both the team leader's approach and the general attitude of the other members. Despite the academic concerns at hand, Soojin's mind began drifting elsewhere. She confessed that she had originally planned to maintain a light meal that day, intending to have a simple salad, but the accumulated stress had altered her appetite, stirring within her a sudden craving for something sweet. Caught between frustration and fatigue, she turned back to Suyeon, implying that she was hoping they could head out together to find a place that might satisfy her craving. Before any response could be offered, Suyeon was interrupted by the sound of her name being called from behind. Turning around, she saw Jaewon approaching, prompting her to pause and wait as he made his way over. Once he reached her, Jaewon conveyed that he had something on his mind, something he was curious about and wanted her to explain. Without much preamble, he directed a rather unexpected inquiry at her, asking about the kind of guys she found appealing. The question came without warning and drew immediate attention. Those around them halted their activities and turned to watch, momentarily stunned by the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Even Haesoo, who was usually composed, seemed taken aback by Jaewon's boldness and sought to confirm whether he was truly serious. Jaewon, however, appeared unfazed, stating that he had asked Suyeon specifically because of her popularity and the assumption that her opinion might carry weight. As Suyeon became aware of the many gazes fixed upon them, discomfort settled in. The setting no longer felt appropriate for such a personal discussion, so she proposed that they relocate to continue their conversation privately. Jaewon accepted the suggestion and the two of them made their way out of the gathering. Their departure left the group in mild confusion, uncertain of what had just transpired. Soojin, in particular, felt a sense of abandonment, unsure of who might now accompany her to quell her sugar cravings. Suyeon and Jaewon walked together down the corridor in silence. Suyeon had expected him to initiate some form of conversation along the way, perhaps to clarify the question he had asked or to lighten the mood, but he remained quiet, his thoughts seemingly elsewhere. The lack of explanation left Suyeon mildly puzzled, though she refrained from pressing him immediately. Eventually, they reached a small restaurant, and without much deliberation, Jaewon ordered an ice cream for himself, which he began eating with visible enjoyment while Suyeon quietly observed him from across the table. The silence lingered until Suyeon finally took the initiative to address the matter. She calmly asked Jaewon why he had posed such a personal question earlier, curious about the intention behind it. Jaewon, while maintaining his usual composure, explained that his curiosity stemmed from a desire to understand what kind of boys girls typically liked. It was not because he was interested in dating someone at the moment, but rather because he wanted to explore whether spending time with someone his age might shift his current feelings. His explanation hinted at an influence beyond himself, something Suyeon quickly realized. He briefly mentioned that Haesoo had encouraged him to consider meeting someone new, implying that this might help divert his focus away from her. Jaewon, however, avoided delving into the details, and Suyeon noticed his reluctance. She recognized that it might be a subject too complex or sensitive for him to comfortably articulate, and she respected the boundary he quietly placed between them. Suyeon chose not to dwell on what he withheld. Instead, she offered a proposition that caught him off guard. With a light but sincere tone, she informed him that if he had some free time that day, she would gladly take the opportunity to show him and offer some guidance on how to meet girls his own age. Jaewon agreed to accompany Suyeon, trusting her guidance despite his uncertainties. Their first stop was a barbershop where Suyeon observed carefully as the stylist reshaped his hair into a more modern and appealing look. She had chosen a style that complemented his features, making subtle yet impactful changes that enhanced his appearance. After the haircut, they continued to the shopping mall, where Suyeon took her time helping him browse through various outfits. She offered candid opinions and suggested combinations that suited his build and complexion, gradually assembling a wardrobe that reflected a more confident and presentable image. When it came time to pay, Suyeon instinctively reached for her wallet, ready to cover the expenses as a gesture of support. However, Jaewon gently declined the offer, appreciating her efforts and insisting that he would handle the cost himself. He acknowledged how much she had already done for him and wanted to repay her kindness in his own way. To express his gratitude, he proposed they grab a proper meal together and guided her to a restaurant he had in mind. Once seated, he encouraged her to order freely, telling her to choose whatever she liked. Their meal was pleasant, filled with light conversation and a sense of ease that had grown between them over the course of the day. By the time they finished eating, the sky had grown dark and they decided to head home. As they walked side by side under the glow of the streetlights, Jaewon expressed his gratitude once more. He admitted that while he appreciated the new look and the thoughtful suggestions she had given him, he still felt unconvinced that changes in appearance alone would lead him to connect with someone. To him, the efforts, though sincere, felt superficial in comparison to the emotional complexities he carried within. Noticing the lingering concern in his voice, Suyeon slowed her steps and turned slightly toward him, her expression softening. She confessed that although she didn't fully understand the details of what he was going through or the motivations behind his sudden desire to reinvent himself, she respected his sincerity and wanted to be there for him. At that point in time, Suyeon had already grown very close to Jaewon. Their bond had become deeper than she had expected, and it felt like they had reached a place where words were no longer enough to explain what was happening between them. One day, while they were together and found themselves stuck in the middle of the road, physically and emotionally, Suyeon's thoughts drifted to her childhood. She remembered moments with her mother that had stayed buried for a long time. She also recalled a time when her father had caught her writing inappropriate things and how disappointed and angry he had been, making her feel deeply ashamed of herself. Even after that moment passed, Suyin continued to say the same thing to Jaewon again and again, that he could use her whenever he wanted, that she would be fine with it no matter what. Jaewon tried to understand her and asked her if she would truly be okay, but she simply repeated her words without hesitation, as if she had already convinced herself that it was the truth. When Suyin got home later that day, she quietly wrote down everything that had happened between her and Jaewon. As she was writing, she recalled that Jaewon had asked her earlier why she was always trying so hard to help him. She remembered that question clearly, but she also knew that if she explained her real reason, it would likely seem insignificant to him. She believed it was too small to matter and possibly too embarrassing to speak about. Her feelings were rooted in a secret habit that she had never told anyone about. Suyin had a habit she couldn't share with anyone. In moments when no one was around, she would often let her imagination run wild. She would write about things that weren't real, stories and scenes that felt like fantasies or even delusions. And in those moments of quiet daydreaming, she felt a kind of strange happiness, something that came from being alone, unseen, and free to think whatever she wanted. She remembered a specific day when she had been writing one of those stories and a friend had suddenly walked into the room. The friend tried to peek at what she was writing, but Suyin quickly shut her book and hid it, not wanting anyone to see the words she had written. Even when her friend, Sujin, insisted on seeing it, Suyin gently pushed her to go outside with her instead. She placed the journal inside a locker and left with Sujin. Later, when Suyin returned to retrieve the book, it was no longer there. She was confused and anxious, wondering what had happened to it. Just then, Jaewon walked into the classroom and pulled out a book from his bag. He asked if that was the one she had been looking for. It was in that moment, through the name written inside the journal, that Jaewon learned Suyin's name for the first time. She rushed over and asked him if he had read what was inside. Jaewon calmly told her he hadn't, that he had only picked it up to keep it safe from others. Still, Suyin wasn't convinced. She found it hard to believe he hadn't opened it. Her mind was filled with worry that he might have seen her strange writing. She begged him not to tell anyone about what was inside, explaining how important it was to her that it remained a secret. Jaewon reassured her, saying that he genuinely had not read it. He told her he didn't like when others gossiped about his private matters either, and that he respected other people's secrets. After that, he handed the journal back to her and told her his name. That day stayed with Suyin. It was the first time she had met someone who didn't try to look into other people's business, who respected her space. From that day on, whenever she wrote her stories, she gave the name of her protagonist as Han Jaewon. Back in the present, when Jaewon returned home, Haesu was waiting for him. She had been worried because it was already late. She looked relieved when she saw him walk in, but she still let him know that he had gotten home much later than expected. Jaewon explained casually that he had been out with friends. Haesu then noticed that his haircut was different and asked him about it. He confirmed it and asked her if it looked okay. She told him it did and reminded him to go take a bath. Jaewon agreed, but first said he needed to send a message to let his friend know he had arrived safely. The following day, Suyin invited Jaewon over to her place. When he arrived, they spent some time going through comic books together, flipping through the pages and sharing light moments. But after a while, Suyin's mind began to drift. She found herself staring at Jaewon's face more than paying attention to the comics. Jaewon noticed her gaze and became curious, asking her why she was looking at him like that. Suyin eventually admitted that she didn't invite him over just to read comics. Before Jaewon fully realized what was happening, Suyin had already begun making small but intentional moves to initiate a workout session with him. She seemed to do it so naturally, as if it were something completely casual between them. However, Jaewon quickly grew uncomfortable. He looked around and noticed that there were still a few people nearby, and the thought of them watching made him uneasy. It felt strange to him, being seen like that with Suyin in such a situation, so he stopped her halfway, politely asking her to hold off. In response, Suyin didn't seem bothered. Instead, she pointed out something to Jaewon. She told him to look at the other side, just beyond the clear glass that separated their space from the next. Jaewon turned and looked where she directed. To his surprise, he saw a couple working out together, clearly comfortable and not minding who might be watching them. Suyin explained that on weekdays it was quite common to see couples doing similar things in that facility. She calmly added that there weren't even that many people present at that moment, and even when there were, no one really paid close attention to what others were doing. It was simply not something people fixated on. Still, Suyin was careful with her words. She quickly added that her explanation wasn't meant to make it seem like she had brought anyone else there before. She wanted Jaewon to understand clearly that this wasn't something she had done with others in the past. In fact, she said she had only come to that place because of him, just for him. Hearing this left Jiwon speechless. He couldn't understand why someone like Suyin, who was well known at school and frequently received confessions from many boys, would go out of her way to do all this just for him. But Suyin didn't care about any of that. She didn't care about how many people liked her or how often she was approached. Those things meant little to her. What truly mattered to her in that moment was something simpler and much more personal, what Jiwon thought about her. That was what she wanted to know. She admitted it honestly, telling him that his opinion was the only one she was curious about. At that point, Suyin noticed the stunned look on Jiwon's face. He seemed caught off guard, as though he hadn't expected any of this. So she asked him whether he was nervous. But Jiwon couldn't even give a proper answer. He was too overwhelmed. At Haisu's office, one of her colleagues had approached her desk and casually asked if she would be working overtime again that day. To his surprise, Haisu responded that she planned to stop work early for once. The colleague, whose name was Jiho, was visibly pleased with her answer. He mentioned that he had noticed how much she had been pushing herself lately and gently reminded her that while work is important, health should never be overlooked. Since Jiho had already wrapped up his tasks, he excused himself, getting ready to leave for the day. Meanwhile, Haisu continued typing at her desk, trying to finish up the remaining bits of her work. Just as Jiho was about to step out, Haisu unexpectedly called him back. She asked, rather calmly, if he had a little time so they could grab a drink together. Jiho was momentarily taken aback, not expecting such a request from someone like her. To be sure, he asked if she truly meant it, and when she nodded with a faint smile, he agreed without hesitation. Once Haisu finished her tasks, they both headed out to a lounge bar nearby. There, seated across from each other under the dim glow of soft lights, they each ordered a drink. Jiho then shared his honest surprise, telling Haisu that he had never imagined he would be sitting down for drinks with a senior colleague like her. He explained that, to his knowledge, no one on their team had ever spent time with her outside work before. Haisu had always been the kind who left immediately after work, rarely attending company dinners or social gatherings. So, to him, it felt unusual but not unpleasant that she had invited him out this time. Sensing something deeper behind her unusual gesture, Jiho cautiously asked whether she had anything on her mind, anything she was dealing with emotionally, since he had noticed her looking distracted at work lately. He explained that her usual energy seemed dimmed and her expressions had been more tense than usual. Haisu was no longer surprised that Jiho had picked up on it. After a pause, she quietly began to open up. She shared that she had recently read a passage from a book that left a strong impression on her. The words struck her in such a way that she decided to shape her life around the sentiment expressed in that passage. To her, it had sounded romantic and meaningful, an ideal she wanted to live by. For a while, following those words gave her clarity. Her emotions and goals felt more certain than ever before. But as time passed, something changed. The feeling she once had began to fade. It felt like the path she was walking, once so sure and bright, had crumbled beneath her. She told Jiho that she now felt bitter, and it hurt because she no longer knew what her heart truly wanted. Her mind had become foggy with confusion, and her inner world, once clear, was now filled with uncertainty. As she spoke these words, tears silently began to fall. Jiho, taken aback by the sudden outpour of emotion, could only listen and offer a quiet sense of support. Seeing that she had reached her emotional limit, Jiho gently suggested they leave the lounge. On the way home, he walked beside her quietly. After a long stretch of silence, he asked in a sincere tone whether she would be all right and if there was anything he could do to help her through what she was feeling. However, as Haisu thought back to how Jiwon had been acting recently, how often he mentioned his new friend, she sincerely hoped he had made a good choice. She quietly wished that this new connection in his life would be a healthy one, especially considering how much he had gone through in the past. On Jiwon's side, his memories drifted back to his childhood, moments he had tried to forget but which still clung to him like shadows. He remembered how other kids used to bully him because they didn't know who his real parents were. Despite his stepmother's genuine efforts in raising him, his peers cruelly referred to him as an orphan, as if his background made him less worthy. The words used to sting deeply, leaving him feeling isolated and bitter. But even then, Haisu had always been by his side. She was the one person who stood up for him, comforted him, and gave him the emotional support he needed when no one else would. Later that day, quite unexpectedly, Haisu happened to run into Jiwon and Suyin just as they were coming out of a building together. The sight caught her a little off guard, but she composed herself quickly. With a small smile, she greeted them and told Jiwon to enjoy his time with his friend, casually reminding him not to come home too late. She added that she would be heading home ahead of him, then turned and walked off calmly. Shortly afterward, she met up with Jiho again so they could continue on their way. Later that evening, Suyin returned to her place. After a warm shower, she lit a few candles and got into bed. She noticed that Jaiwon still hadn't come home yet. As she lay there, her mind wandered back to that brief encounter with Haesoo earlier in the day. She had clearly seen the woman's calm, almost sisterly composure and the way she had looked at them. For some reason, the image stayed with Suyeon. She began reflecting on it and couldn't help but acknowledge how beautiful and composed Haesoo was. In fact, she thought Haesoo and Jaiwon might have made a better match, at least on the surface. She saw Haesoo as graceful and grounded, someone who had always been a big presence in Jaiwon's life. The thought made her smile, though faintly. Deep down, she felt glad, perhaps even relieved, that Jaiwon might have someone so solid looking out for him. With that in mind, she closed her eyes, telling herself that maybe now, with things as they were, Jaiwon would finally stop coming over to her place for workouts. Just as Haesoo was caught up in her thoughts, the sound of the front door opening pulled her back to the present. Turning her head, she saw that it was Jaiwon who had returned. She inquired briefly about the friend he had gone out with, and he casually informed her that Suyeon had already gone home. Acknowledging his return, Haesoo gently urged him to head to his room and get some rest, mentioning that she herself had been on the verge of falling asleep. However, rather than doing as she suggested, Jaiwon quietly made his way to her bed and settled beside her without hesitation. Lying next to her, he brought up his outing with Suyeon, noting that Haesoo didn't seem particularly eager to hear about it, yet he shared the details regardless. He explained that during their time together, Suyeon had broached the subject of feelings, how he truly felt, given the closeness they had developed. When Haesoo prompted him for his response, he admitted that he had told Suyeon he felt nervous, explaining that such situations were unfamiliar and slightly overwhelming for him. But he revealed that the feelings he experienced when he was around Haesoo were entirely different. With Suyeon, there had been a sense of formality and distance, but with Haesoo, there was an unspoken connection, a sense of ease and warmth he couldn't replicate with anyone else. In the stillness that followed, Jaiwon brought up a promise Haesoo had once made, that if, after dating someone closer to his age, he found that his emotions remained unchanged, she would no longer turn him away. Holding on to that promise, he now appealed to her softly but with unmistakable conviction. It was clear that his time with Suyeon had only solidified what he had been feeling all along. He no longer wished to hesitate or explore further possibilities. For him, the answer had become undeniably clear: he wanted Haesoo. Jaiwon is seen as he tries to convince Haesoo that they should work out together, but Haesoo felt things might not be the same as before, to which Jaiwon told her that she can just form ignorance about the whole thing. However, as they proceed with the workout session, Haesoo told him that she is not going to hate him no matter what he does. Jaiwon was grateful for her saying that. She then told him that he should keep talking to Suyeon and other friends he has. She could only agree with him since she doesn't want to push Jaiwon away or rejects him. After all, she considers him as her son. The following day, the neighborhood stirred with the usual morning routines, though the atmosphere carried a heavier, humid weight. Two women stood outside the street as they exchanged small talk about the sudden spike in temperature. One of them, visibly sweating, complained about the heat and expressed her confusion over why the water supply had been cut on a day like this. The other woman, more composed, reassured her that it was only a temporary inconvenience, that the repair work would be done in about 2 hours and they would just have to bear with it for a little while longer. Meanwhile, inside the house, Jaiwon was in the kitchen gulping down a glass of ice-cold water, condensation clinging to the glass as the ice clinked faintly. The refreshing chill brought a fleeting relief, but his mind remained unsettled. He found himself asking inwardly what exactly was bothering him, though no clear answer came. As he turned to glance into the living room, he noticed Haesoo lying on the couch, her posture slack, as if drained by the oppressive heat. She looked still, almost too still, prompting a flicker of concern in him. He walked over and, without hesitation, asked if she was feeling unwell. Haesoo, her eyes barely opening, replied that she wasn't sick, just feeling weighed down by the stifling warmth of the day. After a brief pause, she shifted the conversation and asked about his friend Suyeon, specifically the meeting he had mentioned before. Jaiwon explained casually that while nothing had been set in stone yet, they were planning to meet again soon, though they hadn't quite decided on what to do. He added that he actually had another date scheduled with Suyeon coming up. Haesoo, trying to sound lighthearted despite the sluggishness of the heat, reminded him not to end up being late. Jaiwon smiled faintly at her concern and replied that he had gotten ready ahead of time, so there was still a comfortable margin before he needed to leave. However, Jaiwon expresses that he would like to work out, to which Haesoo reminds him that he has a date with Suyeon, which he replies that he prepared early so he still had some time to work out, to which he eventually proceeded to do so. After finishing the workout session, Jaiwon grew concerned upon realizing there was no water supply available for him to clean up. Just as he was trying to figure out what to do, Haesoo stepped in and offered to help. Jaiwon was later seen stepping out of the house, now fully dressed and composed. A short while after his departure, inside the quiet house, Haisu stirred. She rose from the couch and began preparing herself for the day, reaching for her clothes with a sluggish pace. As she was in the middle of dressing up, a faint noise from the hallway caught her attention, soft but distinct. Thinking that Jiwon had returned unexpectedly, she paused, slightly startled. However, when she cracked the door open just enough to see who it was, she found Kyunga standing there with a cheeky grin, clearly trying to surprise her. Haisu, not fully ready and caught off guard, didn't open the door wide, keeping it only partially ajar. She asked, somewhat curtly, why Kyunga hadn't called beforehand. Kyunga, unbothered by the less-than-warm reception, explained that she felt their last conversation at her place had ended too abruptly and she figured she could drop by before heading to the gym. She then asked if she could come in briefly, saying she just wanted to wash her hands. Haisu, still not quite prepared for guests, told her to wait a moment, her tone polite but firm. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Suyeon was in her room standing in front of a mirror, adjusting her dress and carefully inspecting her appearance. She seemed both excited and anxious, hoping silently that Jiwon would like how she looked. Once satisfied, she made her way downstairs where her father happened to be reading the paper. Suyeon casually mentioned that she would be attending a study group session today. Her father, without lowering the paper, questioned whether she was truly going to study at one of those upscale group meetings and not heading elsewhere. With a slight pause, she affirmed that it was indeed a study session, adding that she wanted to learn from the upperclassmen and saw it as a good opportunity. With that, she took her leave. But after Suyeon had left, her father's demeanor shifted. He placed the paper aside, reached for his phone, and made a call. With a quiet urgency in his voice, he instructed the person on the other end that there was something important he needed them to look into. He emphasized that the matter must remain confidential and should be handled discreetly, hinting that his trust in Suyeon's words might not be absolute. Later that day, Jiwon and Suyeon were seen sitting side by side on a bench in a children's playground. The sun was beginning to soften, casting long shadows across the ground. Suyeon appeared cheerful and engaged, but Jiwon seemed distracted, his eyes trailing distant thoughts as he remained quiet. She had to call his name multiple times before he finally turned to her, snapping out of his reverie. Apologizing, he admitted that he had something on his mind. Trying to shift the mood, he suggested they change locations, perhaps find someplace livelier. But Suyeon stopped him gently, asking him to wait a little longer. With a playful smile, she leaned in and asked if he was up for trying something exciting. As Kyunga stood outside the door, she gave Haisu a pointed look, half joking, half serious, and asked if she was being kept out again because of what happened the last time she visited. Her tone carried a light accusation, suggesting that Haisu might still be holding a grudge. Haisu quickly clarified that it wasn't about that at all, there was simply no running water at home at the moment due to a temporary cut-off in the neighborhood. She added that she would go fetch some wet wipes to make things more convenient and gently asked Kyunga to wait outside a bit longer. Later, the two were seen on a tennis court exchanging serves and playing with the energy of friends trying to shake off the weight of everyday life. The rhythmic thud of tennis balls and the occasional sound of laughter filled the air, blending with the faint rustle of summer leaves in the background. By the time they wrapped up their game, the sun had mellowed slightly, casting a warm glow over the court. Afterward, they made their way to a nearby vending machine. With sweat on their brows and their rackets hanging loosely by their sides, they took a moment to rehydrate. Kyunga sighed with a smile and remarked how good it felt to finally exercise again. She said it felt like all the tension and stress she had been carrying had started to melt away. But as she glanced at Haisu beside her, she noticed the younger woman had grown unusually quiet. Sensing something off, Kyunga asked if Haisu was still bothered about what happened previously, clearly referring to a recent event that had left her unsettled. Haisu didn't respond right away but instead asked, almost out of the blue, if Kyunga had ever been addicted to something before. Taken slightly off guard by the question, Kyunga thought for a moment and then answered that if shopping counted, then yes, there had been a time when she was deeply immersed in it. Haisu then asked her how one could possibly overcome such an addiction, her voice calm but laced with an introspective edge. In response, Kyunga shared a rather curious analogy, recalling a trivia question she once heard, though she couldn't remember where or from whom. She explained it like this: if one places a cup of hot water and a cup of cold water into the freezer at the same time, which one would freeze first? Haisu responded with what seemed like the obvious answer, cold water. But Kyunga shook her head and said that, surprisingly, the answer was hot water, at least according to the person who posed the question. It defied logic, but apparently if the experiment were conducted, hot water often froze more quickly under the right conditions. Kyunga then leaned on this metaphor to make her point. She explained that sometimes when someone becomes too obsessed with something, so caught up that it dominates their thoughts, the worst thing they could do is try to suppress it. Instead, she suggested, why not give in fully? Let it consume you, run its course, and eventually, just like hot water freezing rapidly, it would reach a point of saturation and burn itself out. But suppressing it would only keep it simmering beneath the surface, returning again and again to haunt the mind. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Jaewon and Suyeon were seen arriving at a modest motel room. The atmosphere had shifted between them, tinged with anticipation and a certain tension. Suyeon, though outwardly composed, showed subtle signs of nervousness, hesitation in her steps. Jaewon, noticing this, moved gently and tried to reassure her. While Jaewon and Suyeon continued their workout session, focused and in sync, Haesoo was at home tending to the dishes. As she scrubbed the last plate, a sudden thought struck her. She had completely forgotten to hang the laundry. As they moved through their workout, Jaewon couldn't help but notice how animated Suyeon had become. Her energy was infectious and there was a brightness in her demeanor he hadn't quite seen before. At college, she always carried herself with a composed and modest presence, reserved, like someone constantly aware of being watched. But now, in this private, unguarded space, she was glowing with excitement, laughing freely and teasing him between their light exercises. To Jaewon, it felt like being with a completely different version of her, one unburdened by expectations, liberated from her usual polished image. Once they wrapped up, with breaths still heavy and cheeks flushed from exertion, Suyeon glanced at her phone and noted the time. Her expression shifted with mild concern as she realized it was nearing her curfew. She mentioned she had to head home but insisted on walking Jaewon first, almost as if reluctant to end their time together just yet. Jaewon tried to protest, saying that it should be the other way around and that he would walk her instead, but she gently cut him off. Her tone was light, but the meaning was serious. Her father was strict, and if she returned late, especially after a date, there would be consequences. She assured him she'd be fine. As they approached Jaewon's apartment complex, their steps slowed, the air between them filled with a quiet understanding. Unbeknownst to them, from a window above, Haesoo watched silently. She remained out of sight, her expression unreadable, but her eyes followed them until they disappeared inside. Later that night, Suyeon returned home, carefully slipping through the front door. She glanced around the living room and, seeing no sign of her father, sighed in relief. For a brief moment, she believed she had managed to avoid any confrontation. Thinking he must have gone to bed early, she made her way toward her room, hopeful she could end the night quietly. But as she opened her door, she froze. Her father was already inside, seated with his back slightly hunched and his face drawn in a cold expression of disappointment. Without raising his voice, he asked her if she had completely lost her mind, his tone heavy with restrained anger. Then, with a swift motion, he flung a handful of photos onto the floor in front of her, images of her and Jaewon candidly captured from a distance. He accused her of defying his warnings. He reminded her that during this crucial period in his political campaign, he had explicitly told her not to draw attention to herself. And yet here she was, out in public with a boy. He blamed Jaewon, convinced that it was his influence leading Suyeon astray, and muttered that the boy needed to be dealt with, warned harshly so he'd never dare speak to her again. Suyeon stood frozen for a moment, then slowly crouched to gather the photos. As she stared at Jaewon's face in one of the pictures, something shifted within her. Her expression turned still, almost distant, and in a low voice, she muttered that now she understood finally why her father had spent all these years obsessively raising goldfish. Suyeon had stood before her father that evening, her eyes unwavering. She tried to understand her place in his world, questioning whether she was anything more to him than the goldfish he so meticulously tended to, those silent, fragile creatures living within the narrow confines of a glass tank. For the longest time, she had admired what she once perceived as his deep sense of responsibility, believing that even a simple goldfish deserved his care and consistency. He fed them daily, kept their tank clean, and made sure their little ecosystem remained intact, and from this she once drew comfort, imagining herself cared for in much the same way. But the illusion had worn thin. The truth, she now realized, was far colder. The goldfish were not cherished companions but merely ornamental, trapped, wordless beings circling endlessly within the narrow walls of his carefully controlled world. And in that bleak confinement, Suyeon saw herself reflected. Her father, startled by her shift in demeanor, could not help but assume that someone else must be influencing her, perhaps Jaewon, the only person who had stood close enough to hear the cracks in her voice. He suspected manipulation, possibly even conspiracy, as if the sincerity of her anguish could only be manufactured. The thought that Suyeon might be genuinely hurting, genuinely lost, seemed beyond his comprehension. But Suyeon had reached her limit. With a voice steadier than her trembling heart, she asserted that Jaewon was not like her father. Jaewon had never tried to silence her pain with logic or suspicion. He had listened, seen the world from her side of the glass, and offered empathy instead of judgment. The sting of her words left her father stunned. He could barely recognize the young woman standing before him, and in his shock, he muttered that she had gone mad. Soo-yeon didn't deny it. If madness was what it took to finally feel alive, then so be it. For the first time, she felt something close to liberation. The invisible chains she had worn all her life, of duty, of silence, of obedience, were breaking. She declared that this was the end of her time within his suffocating world and walked out, asking him not to come looking for her. Not until she chose to be found. Left in the heavy silence of her absence, her father lingered in disbelief. He kept repeating to himself that she had lost her mind, perhaps to convince himself more than anyone else. Then came the sound, a sharp crash echoing from downstairs. Alarmed, he rushed to the source. The sight that greeted him was one of disarray. His once pristine aquarium lay in ruins, water soaked into the carpet, glass fragments scattered across the floor, and the goldfish gone. He stood frozen, trying to make sense of it, wondering where Soo-yeon had taken them and what it all meant. Elsewhere, Soo-yeon knelt at the edge of a quiet river, cradling the small bowl that now held the fish. With delicate care, she released them into the current, watching as they swam away into the freedom they had never known. The gentle flow of the river carried more than just the fish, it carried her memories, too. She remembered a distant afternoon from childhood when her mother had lovingly told her that she could read without help now, a small gesture of trust and independence. That moment had been followed by heartbreak as her mother, eyes brimming with unspoken sorrow, told her she would be away for a while. It had been the first time Soo-yeon understood what absence meant. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered a farewell not only to the goldfish but to everything they had symbolized. The next morning, in a different corner of the city, the household stirred awake. Hae-soo had risen early and was already preparing breakfast in the kitchen. She moved with quiet focus, planning to finish some housework before leaving for her job. Jae-won emerged from his room, still groggy from sleep, surprised to see her up and about so soon. While she reminded him to wash up and get ready, he had other intentions. Spurred by a restless energy, he suggested they work out together. At first, Hae-soo hesitated, unsure if it was a good idea. But the memory of Kyungga's recent advice lingered in her mind, something about the importance of presence, of doing things together, even the small ones. So she agreed. During the middle of their workout, Jae-won abruptly paused. A flicker of urgency crossed his face as he remembered something. He muttered that he had completely forgotten he needed to visit the college administration office that morning. Without giving much time for further exchange, he excused himself and hurriedly left, leaving Hae-soo standing there in surprise, a towel still in her hand and her breath slightly uneven from the brief exertion. She hadn't expected him to leave so suddenly, nor had she expected how hollow the room would feel without him in it. On the bus, Jae-won stared out the window at the passing cityscape until his phone buzzed. It was a message from Sungbik, Soo-yeon's moving out. She's decided to live on her own. The words sat heavily on the screen, and for a moment, Jae-won simply stared at them, as if trying to process not just the message, but the ripple it would send through all of them. Meanwhile, at her workplace, Hae-soo found herself standing in front of the mirror in the office restroom. The sound of running water and the low hum of fluorescent lights filled the quiet space. She thought back to that morning, to the suddenness of Jae-won's departure. She questioned, just for a moment, whether it had truly been about college, or whether it was Soo-yeon who lingered behind his decision. The thought made her uneasy, but she quickly brushed it aside. This distance, independence, emotional space was what she had always said she wanted. She had longed for breathing room, for Jae-won to begin finding his own way. Yet now that it was happening, she couldn't quite understand the emptiness that came with it. As evening settled in, Hae-soo returned home. The familiar silence greeted her at the door as she changed and moved to the kitchen, absent-mindedly starting on the dishes. The clinking of ceramic and the rush of warm water became a quiet background to her thoughts, which stubbornly returned to that morning's interaction. She stole a glance toward the living room, where Jae-won sat, casually leaning back with his phone in hand. His face was calm, unreadable. Far too calm, she thought. He didn't seem troubled, or burdened, or even distracted. If anything, he looked almost indifferent, his attention buried in his phone as his fingers moved rapidly across the screen. The steady flurry of his texting caught her attention. He hadn't spoken much since he got back, nor had he offered any updates about the college visit or his day. She couldn't help but wonder, despite herself, if he was talking to Soo-yeon. If perhaps the two of them were involved in a way she hadn't anticipated. That idea brought with it a strange twist in her chest, something unnameable and persistent. It wasn't just jealousy or suspicion. It was something quieter, heavier, a recognition that things had changed. Where there had once been idle chatter, small bickering, and moments of unexpected warmth, now there was silence. After finishing the dishes, she prepared to head out. He noticed and remarked on it, prompting her to mention that she needed to go to the smart store to pick up a few things, suggesting he could have some fruit in the meantime. Jaiwon proposed that, if it wasn't urgent, she could postpone the trip until tomorrow and let him handle it instead. However, she insisted the items were necessary and left immediately. Concerned about the late hour, Jaiwon decided to accompany her. As she pushed the cart through the aisles, she couldn't help but wonder if he would remain absorbed in his phone despite tagging along. Unbeknownst to her, Jaiwon was actually engaged in a light-hearted chat with Sungbik. Irritated, she eventually snapped that she was done shopping, indicating they should head home. From her tone alone, Jaiwon could tell she was in an unusually sour mood. On their way back, it began to rain, soaking their shopping bags. Jaiwon commented with some regret that he would have brought an umbrella if he had known the weather would turn. Back home, noticing her fatigue, he offered her the chance to shower first. She asked what he planned to do, and he mentioned needing to make a quick call to a friend. Instead, she proposed they shower together. After a moment of hesitation, he agreed. Later, it dawned on him that her frustration likely stemmed from something he had done earlier that morning. Feeling a bit guilty, he decided to ease the tension with some affectionate flattery. As they were about to begin their workout, Jaiwon's phone started ringing. Although he instinctively turned toward it, Haesoo was clearly unwilling to let the interruption derail their session. She firmly urged him to stay focused, insisting they continue, even as the phone kept ringing in the background. As their workout session began, Jaiwon's phone continued to ring persistently. Though Haesoo had urged him to ignore it and stay focused, the repeated calls eventually pushed Jaiwon to admit that it sounded urgent. He excused himself and stepped outside to answer, ultimately leaving the house. Haesoo, left behind in the quiet room, couldn't help but feel a growing sense of loneliness and disappointment, unsettled by the fact that he was once again walking out on her. Jaiwon made his way to a nearby bar where he found Sungbik already drinking. The moment Sungbik spotted him, his face lit up with relief and joy as he threw his arms around him in a spontaneous embrace. He quickly explained the reason behind his urgent call. Earlier, during their phone conversation, he had mentioned in passing that Sujin and Suyeon were now living on their own. Unfortunately, Byundu had been nearby and overheard the conversation. In a slip of the tongue, Sungbik had also revealed the location of their residence without realizing the potential consequences. He expressed his concern, pointing out that Sujin had explicitly told him to share that information only with Jaiwon. Now, with Byundu unintentionally in the loop, he feared he might have betrayed their trust. Jaiwon, trying to steady the situation, questioned why Sujin had disclosed their whereabouts to Sungbik in the first place. Sungbik explained that it had come up casually during a shared meal. It hadn't seemed like a big deal at the time. Reassuring him, Jaiwon promised to speak with Suyeon and clarify things. He believed she was more perceptive than she let on and that, with some forewarning, she would be able to manage the situation. If any issues did arise, she could simply reach out, and they would be there to help. Relieved and deeply grateful, Sungbik repeatedly thanked him, visibly comforted by the assurance. Back at home, Haesoo sat alone, staring at the clock, restlessly waiting for Jaiwon's return. Sleep escaped her as she kept wondering when he would finally come back. When Jaiwon finally returned home, the clock had already struck midnight. He hadn't intended to be out so late, but listening to Sungbik's entire story had taken longer than expected. Assuming Haesoo had already gone to bed, he moved quietly through the house. However, upon entering his room, he was surprised to find her lying there, seemingly asleep. What he didn't realize was that she was only pretending, her breathing steady but her mind alert. Jaiwon spoke softly to himself, reflecting on how he had been holding back, choosing not to act selfishly and instead trying to be more considerate of her feelings. It was in that moment that Haesoo began to understand the distance he'd been keeping lately. It hadn't been disinterest or indifference. It had been restraint, an effort to prioritize her comfort over his own desires. Eventually, Jaiwon caught on that she wasn't truly asleep. The realization that she had waited for him, that she had been worried he wouldn't come home, touched him deeply.